Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Ichigo becomes a god of all Shinigami? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the NANTO99 for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. Let's start this video. Our story begins in a common, simple bedroom of a two-store house, one with a bed, a closet, a desk and a wardrobe. The light of the sun, shining through the clear and beautiful skies of the city known as Karakura town, had just begun to make its way through the window of the room, illuminating the one who occupied the bed. A still asleep tall, lean and well-built teen that had spiky orange hair wearing a white sleeveless shirt and black trousers. He was none other than Ichigo Kurosaki, the former substitute Soul Reaper, the victor of Sasuke-zen, and the hero of the Winter War, now just a normal human being, having lost his powers with that final attack he used to nearly kill the evil leader of the Arankor army. The waged war towards the Soul Society after a century and more of plotting, raising an army and creating the device he would have needed to evolve into, in his own words, a being that transcended both Hollows and Soul Reapers, overthrow the Soul King, and remake the world in his image. That attack, appropriately named Final Jutsuga Tensho, destroyed his illusion conjuring Zanpakuto, Kyoka Sujetsu, and weakened him to the point of allowing the sealing Kido that Kisukirahara had planted to finally take effect and finally seal the vile and megalomaniac Aizen once and for all. After which Ichigo went through the inevitable process of losing his powers. Not too long after reuniting with his friends, he collapsed on the ground screaming in pain and passed out. That was just the beginning. He woke up 10 days later in Rukia's house, once again surrounded by his friends, by then having completely recovered from the many injuries they sustained during their battles against the fearsome Arankors, the members of Aizen's army. It was then that he learned that the first stage of the loss of his powers, aside from much pain and a loss of consciousness for 10 whole days, reversed the flow of time his body experienced in the precipice world, also known as the Dangai. In other words, the 3 months he spent there learning the final Jutsuga Tensho, which equaled just 1 hour of time in the living world, due to the difference in time passing there being 2,000 times denser compared to the living world. In other words, 1 hour in the living world is equivalent to 2,000 hours in the precipice world, that is, 3 months, were simply gone. As if he never lived for those 3 months. And by that point, his Soul Reaper powers were already gone. After which it was only a matter of time before, in the second stage, his remaining spiritual pressure would stabilize itself before vanishing completely. And that is exactly what happened 20 days later. He could no longer sense spiritual presences anymore. He had just enough time to say goodbye to Rukia, the one who had given him everything before she faded away forever, thanking her for everything she did for him, and giving the regards to all the other Soul Reapers he had become friends with. After which he resumed his life as a normal human again, with the difference that he could no longer see ghosts again. And today was no different. In fact, right at this moment, as it had become custom for many, many years, just as our former hero was about to wake up. "Good morning, Ichigo," came an all too familiar and goofy voice. And for the 100th, if not 1000th of time this year, his dad, Isen Kurosaki, a tall and muscular man in his 40s with spiky black hair, brown eyes, thin facial hair around his mouth and on his cheeks, and wearing a white pajama with pink spots, behaved like a child and tried to wake his son up the same way he did for 10 years and more. That is, by jumping on him. Ast. Head in the clouds equals watch V equals K4VTZ01A 7 grams. And as it turned out, for the umpteenth time, due to how loud Isen usually was, Ichigo opened his brown eyes and calmly and swiftly slammed his right hand on Isen's face, stopping him mid-air, before slamming him to the ground with a comical thud. As his dad comically grunted in pain, Ichigo sighed in slight annoyance and boredom, and calmly remarked, "For real, Dad, when will you decide to grow up? Even Karen and Yuzu aren't children anymore." This whole thing had been going on for so many years that he just can't even bring himself to get mad every time his dad acted so childishly. Actually, it was so embarrassing it wasn't even worth getting angry over it. "Do you really have gotten strong, my boy? There really is nothing left for me to teach you, my son," casually muttered Isen, his head still being pressed on by Ichigo's right hand. "Ugh, how is he my dad again?" thought the orange-haired strawberry with a sweat drop. How did his dad used to be a Soul Reaper was beyond him. "Breakfast's ready," came yet another voice from the lower floor, this time a cute and girly one belonging to Ichigo's older sister, Yuzu. And with that, Ichigo put on his grey school uniform and along with his dad, went downwards and promptly saw that Karen was already sitting at the table, eating rice with the soy sauce and other vegetables, while Yuzu was in the final steps of cooking the scrambled eggs that she would often make for her older brother at breakfast. Ichigo took the time to spare a glance to his sisters. Both Yuzu and Karen had definitely begun to grow up and become more womanly with their curves, as they turned 13 not too long ago. Yuzu's light blonde hair had now grown to shoulder length and was now tied in two pigtails with pink cherry baubles behind her ears, with her hair clip on her right pigtail. Likewise, her face had become even more prettier than it already was, what with her light brown eyes and all. Karen, on the other hand, now wore her black hair that she got from her father and matched the color of her eyes in a short ponytail, and her bust, unlike Yuzu's, had begun to develop. Needless to say, she had begun to become more attractive, just like her older sister. "Morning, Yuzu." "Morning, Karen," greeted Ichigo as he sat down, with a casual tone. Then Yuzu set down the eggs she made for her brother, and the orange-haired teen smiled sweetly at her. Then Issen took his seat at the table and all four of them began to eat. Midway through breakfast, Ichigo noticed that Karen, without even taking her eyes off her bowl, seemed to nonchalantly poke at something with her chopsticks. Although Ichigo couldn't see it, she was poking at the spirit of middle-aged man's glasses, which was looking at her with hearts in its eyes due to how pretty she looked. With a funny, bewildered look, he asked her something going on, Karen, to which his younger sister replied stoically, with her eyes closed while she was drinking her soup, "Nothing." Ichigo merely shrugged and resumed eating. "So," chimed in Issen, after a few minutes of silence to lighten up the mood, "got any special activities planned this winter holidays with your friends?" Ichigo merely shook his head before answering, "Dunno. Kigo said he was gonna throw up a party at his sister's house next Thursday. Even invited Uryu, Chad, Orihime and me." He paused before his face took on an awkward expression. That being said, "I'm not sure his sister will agree to it, given how violent she is." Upon remembering that one time a few months ago, when she outright crushed her brother's balls with one of her bare hands for forgetting to buy some milk. Needless to say, poor Kigo couldn't sit well for a whole week after that. Honestly, the more he thought about it, the more Mizuho reminded him of Kukaku due to how temperamental and aggressive she was. "I think you should go, big brother. I mean, you're on your final year of high school, right?" chimed in Yuzu, sitting on his left, just as happy as any day. That was something Ichigo truly loved about her. How she always seemed happy in spite of how after her mother died, she decided to take care of the housework despite her young age on a daily basis. "Your point, Yuzu?" he asked her, still keeping his casual look on his face. "You don't know if you'll see them again after you graduate. It's possible they will all go to different colleges after high school. So I think that taking the opportunity to spend time with them like this will leave you with some very fun and sweet memories when you'll have your own family," declared his older sister with a sweet and caring smile on her soft lips. Only to then be chastised by Karen, who remarked, "You don't have to remind him, Yuzu. He'll be a grown man in a few years. You should think more about yourself and enjoy your adolescence while it lasts." She then paused before looking at her dad and adding, "And before you end up like this clown over here," causing her dad to comically gasp in shock and his eyes to widen. "Oh, come on, Karen. Why must you always be so mean?" Dear Yuzu was just giving Ichigo some sisterly advice. "And besides, you could bring some friends home yourself, you know." Sobbed Issen like a child, dismayed that his daughter was treating him like that, while Ichigo and Yuzu sweat dropped at their father's childish antics. "Oh please, all of them would stop hanging out with me if they met you," snorted Karen in response, earning a cute chuckle from Yuzu, while Ichigo simply smiled and petted Yuzu on the head for the advice she gave him. "Don't worry, Yuzu, I will," he replied tenderly, while looking at her in the eyes. But while Yuzu smiled back, Issen sobbed even more, and without a shred of dignity, he went to the poster of his late wife on the wall, hugged it with downright disturbing vigor, and cried out, "Oh Masaki, do you see how our beautiful daughter treats me? After all the years I've raised her and all the baths I've given and all the diapers I've changed, she still won't let me meet her friends. My precious little girl doesn't love me anymore," he cried out, causing his son and daughters to sweat drop again. Ichigo then took the opportunity to get up from the table and say, "Later guys." And with that he walked out of his house's door with his bag rested on his left shoulder. Soundtrack ends. As he exited his house, he took the time to think back at what happened just a year ago. Honestly, he couldn't believe that a year had already passed from his battle with Aizen. He also couldn't believe how well it went when Orihime, Uryu and Chad revealed to Totsuki and the rest of his friends what Ichigo had been doing in all those months, ever since the night Rukia gave him her powers. Then again, there wasn't much room for doubt, given how Kigo, Totsuki, Mizuru, Chizuru and even Don Kanonji had witnessed the godly Aizen with their own eyes, the former captain, empowered by the Hijyoku, having gone after them just to test his powers. If anything, Ichigo was glad they accepted it without any questions, even if Totsuki had her own share of scolding to give him for lying to them the entire time. "Morning, Ichigo," came the voice of one of those friends, Mizuru Kojima, waiting for him so that they could walk together to school. The young man had changed the style of his black hair. It was now straight and it covered his ears. In a way it made him look quite a lot like Akaku's friend, that flamboyant soul reaper called Yumichike Asagawa. Except Mizuru still looked very young for his age, due to how soft and sweet his face looked. Ichigo merely smiled and waved at him before he stopped and spared one final look at his house, which was also the privately owned medical clinic Kurosaki Clinic, which specialized in just about any injuries or diseases except major surgeries. Karen, Yuzu and sometimes even Ichigo often assisted their father Isan as nurses. He thought back at what happened with Karen a few minutes ago. From the looks of it, it seemed that in the last year, his younger sister's spirit energy started growing stronger, thus she could see spirits even better now. Although from the looks of it, Karen wasn't too thrilled about it. Then again, some dead people's souls could be quite annoying, given how some people were just as strange in life as they were in the afterlife. Morning, Mizuro. Let's go. Greeted Ichigo after putting his thoughts aside. And with that they left for what was going to be yet another ordinary day in Karakura town. Yet again, for another day, as soon as Ichigo and Mizuro reached their school and made their way in the corridor, in which students from all years were chatting with each other before their respective lessons would start. The extremely goofy, overdramatic and hyperactive voice of Kigo Asano rang through the corridor as the brown-haired teenager once again darted through the corridor and through many other students before launching himself towards Ichigo in an attempt to hug him. This time, Ichigo, with a bored look, greeted Yo. Simply sidestepped to the left and as a result, Kigo fell on the ground with a loud and comical thud. Mizuro simply rolled his eyes at yet another of his goofy friend's charades and casually said, "Oh well. See you later guys." "Yeah. Guess I'll see you later at lunch, then," said Ichigo, while Kigo still lied on the ground, mumbling incomprehensible pain noises. Then as Ichigo made his way to his classroom, he promptly spotted none other than the last of the Quincy's, Uri Shida, already sitting on his chair, reading his maths book for the interrogation of today. He hadn't changed much in the last year, aside from the bangs of his chin-length black hair, now hanging mostly on the right side of his face and the rest behind his left ear. And he was still, as Kigo often put it, the number one nerd of Karakura High School. Much to his chagrin. Not that it should be surprising given the rich family he came from and his aspiration to become a doctor. "Hey there, Uryu." Casually greeted Ichigo after smacking him wholeheartedly on the back, causing him to gasp, let go of the book he was reading and grunt in pain. "What the hell did you do that for, you idiot?" "I was in the middle of revising for tomorrow's interrogation." He yelled back at him, ever the melodramatic fellow. Ichigo merely sighed and asked, "You never change, man. Like, do you always have to be so uptight? Life isn't just about school and studying, you know." While resting his bag on his own desk. In response, Uryu simply readjusted his glasses, closed his blue eyes, and scoffed MMPH. "How typical for someone as stubborn and simple-minded as you. Except that one always has to set goals in his life. Life is short and..." "Yeah, I can see why you're not popular with the girls," teased Ichigo, interrupting his eloquent speech and earning a funny scowl from the black-haired nerd. "What does that even have to do with you know what, forget it." Began again the irritated black-haired Quincy before changing the subject. "More importantly, did you bring back that history book I lent you? I need it for the exam next week." Remembering the book he had asked from him to study from for the same exam next week, Ichigo nodded and replied, "Yeah, don't worry. I've got it right here." But as he began to search for it in his bag, his eyes widened slightly after seeing something else. A wooden pendant with an X engraved on it and a cartoonish-looking skull engraved in its center. His substitute Soul Reaper badge, the device he would often use to separate his soul from his body, which allowed him to continue his duty before the Winter War and the Arankor invasion took place. And like that, all at once, dozens of memories came back. Noticing the worried, contemplative and somewhat gloomy look on his face, Uryu asked Ichigo, "Is something wrong? Did you forget it?" His voice remaining as calm and collected as ever. Taken out of his thoughts, the orange-haired teen replied, "Don't worry, I got it." With a fake annoyed tone before pulling the book out and handing it back to his friend. "Well now, you two seem to be in good spirits today." "Hi Ichigo." "Hi Ryu." Came two more voices of two teenage girls, two more of Ichigo's friends as they entered the class, a teasing one and one so sweet and enchanting, one would be quick to mistake it for that of either an angel or a fairy. The first voice belonged to a beautiful, lean but well-built teenage girl of average height, with long almost lavender-colored hair that reached past her shoulders and brown eyes. Tatsuki Arasawa, the local tomboy of Karakura High School and karate prodigy, the first friend Ichigo had ever made. She had known him for 13 whole years ever since they met at the dojo she used to train. It was there that they learned karate together, in fact not once was Ichigo able to beat her in a karate match. They shared many happy and sad events, including the pain and the coping Ichigo had to deal when his mother died 8 years ago. The second voice belonged to an even more gorgeous girl of average height that had light gray-colored eyes, long waist-length orange hair, worn in bangs tucked behind her ears with hairpins and a slender yet curvaceous physique, complete with a pair of large breasts. She was Orihime, Tatsuki's childhood friend, and the same girl Ichigo, and his friends fought with all of their might to save from Aizen and his army's clutches when the 4th Espada Ulquiorra Cipher kidnapped her and forced her to join the Arrancar army due to the danger her power to reject reality posed to the former captain of Squad 5's plans. In many ways, she was the complete opposite of her purple-haired tomboy friend. A girl so kind, friendly, optimistic and sensitive that she would go as far as heal even those who once sought to hurt her and her friends mere minutes ago. So powerful was her kindness that she simply was unable to bear any grudges. And now, 1 year later, her body had become much more womanly and her hair was fuller and wavier, her bangs framing her beautiful face without the need of hair clips that now hanged over her ears. "Morning, Tatsuki." "Hi, Orihime." Casually greeted Ichigo as the two girls sat at their respective desks. As the rest of the students then began to sit at their respective desks, the orange-haired teen noticed that one of them seemed to be missing. As he then saw Ichigo sitting next to him, he asked him, "Hey, now that I think about it, where's Chad? Been a few days since I last saw him." In response, Ichigo leaned on the back of his chair, stared blankly at the ceiling, and replied, "He said he wanted to find a high-paying job in order to get some money. Apparently he was considering joining the soccer team." Raising a brow in slight surprise, Ichigo remarked, "That's new. I never thought of him as someone obsessed with money. That said, he would definitely make for a great goalkeeper." Realizing that given how massive he was even for his age and how surprisingly nimble he was, it seemed like the perfect role for him in a team. Putting his hands behind his head, Ichigo said, "Who knows? He might be saving some money for after graduation." He then paused and looked away before continuing, "He might even move out after he's done with school. He did say to me that he wanted to make himself a career out of boxing." Then an annoyed and dejected look made its way on his face. "It sucks, man. That way, he won't have time to hang out with us," he finally declared. "That's funny. You make it sound like he actually ever wanted to hang out with you," remarked casually Ichigo, causing his brown-haired friend to nearly jump out of his chair. "What?" cried out Ichigo, turning towards the orange-haired teen, his eyes already teary-eyed and beginning to comically wave his arms left and right. "What the hell is your problem, man? I have better stuff to do than wasting Chad's time when he has to work so damn hard and earn money." "Then why did you even invite him to that party at your you-know-what? Forget it, I don't wanna know," lectured Ichigo, embarrassed at his friend's childish antics that even made his father's look awkward. "How is he my same age, again?" he thought, with a sweat drop. At that moment the teacher entered the class and after announcing, "Alright class, take your seats." Today's lesson began, the first of several. And from then on, things got averager and averager as they were each day. However, during those lessons, Ichigo took the time to hold the substitute Soul Reaper badge and look at it with a blank and purposeless gaze, with even a hint of melancholy in it. "Ever since I lost my Soul Reaper powers, my combat pass has also stopped. Visual barriers gone and the hollow alarm doesn't go off anymore. Now it's nothing more than a piece of wood. I even forgot that I left it in my school bag. Still, it's the only evidence I have left of my Soul Reaper past." Thought back Ichigo, recalling all the fond memories of his time as a Soul Reaper. The night Rukia gave him her powers, the many battles against the Hollows, the many souls he rescued and brought to the Soul Society via Konso, how he and his friends faced the entirety of the Soul Society by themselves in their quest to save Rukia. Mistakenly sentenced to death due to how Aizen had deceived and manipulated everyone within the Soul Society by conjuring the illusion of Central 46 with his Zanpakuto Kyoka Sujetsu, while the real members of Central 46 were dead all along, and finally his battles against the many powerful Arrancars and his quest to save Orihime. Even though he didn't choose to become one, he liked being a Soul Reaper, and most of all, he had the power to protect those he cared about, his greatest motivation for living, other than wanting nothing more than a simple life as any other human being. He then spared a glance at Uryu, who was standing right in front of the class board, being picked by the teacher for today's interrogation and, predictably, carrying it out flawlessly as befitting of a nerd such as him. And now it's Uryu who's taken over exterminating the Hollows I used to handle. I just hope he doesn't overdo things and upset the Soul Society. He mused to himself in his mind, recalling how, unlike the Soul Reapers who purify the spirits of the sins they committed as Hollows through their swords, thus allowing them to enter the Soul Society as pluses, when Quincy's killed Hollows, they destroy all of them, even what's left of their former human soul, thus affecting the spiritual balance of the worlds. Though, from what he heard apparently he had begun to work with Kisuke, having agreed to go after them only when the owner of the Urahara shop would ask him to. Speaking of the Soul Society, ever since our last goodbye, Rukia hasn't come to visit Karakura town even once, he mused again, this time in sadness, thinking back to the young, black-haired woman that had given him the strength to protect those he cared about. The bond of friendship he shared with her was a very powerful one. He owed her everything for what he did for him and his friends, and for how she didn't think twice about leaving her post in the Soul Society with Renji and join Ichigo and his friends in their quest to rescue Orihime from Aizen's fortress, Las Notches. Later, at the roof of the school. After an ordinary lunch with his friends, Ichigo was now staring aimlessly towards the view the roof of the school offered of Karakura town, leaning his chest on the guardrail and drinking orange juice. Most of his friends had already left, leaving him with only Tatsuki and Kigo to keep him company. "So, have you thought about your plans for the future?" asked the lavender-haired tomboy, who was leaning on the guardrail on her back, pulling him out of his gazing trance. "Huh? You mean after high school?" he asked casually, after turning his head slightly towards her, earning a nod from her. He then gazed back at the view before him and simply sighed and replied, "We still have some time," while taking a sip out of his juice. Kigo, who was stretching his back by putting his feet on the lower horizontal bar of the guardrail and by holding onto the upper one with his hands, then jovially chimed in, "Well, we're about to start getting some career counseling after this semester, so you'll have to start thinking about that stuff pretty soon." While getting up and also resting his back towards the guardrail, besides Tatsuki. "You also had good grades to start with too, but then you bottomed out," pointed out the lavender-haired tomboy with a casual smile, causing Ichigo to scowl in annoyance, look away and snort, "Stop reminding me. Had a lot of stuff going on last year, it can't be helped. And besides, I'm still above average." As he resumed sipping his juice, Kigo sat down and asked him, "What about Rukia?" causing Ichigo to gasp in slight surprise. "I wonder how she's doing these days." While staring at the wide blue skies that had few clouds today, remembering the fond memories of the time Rukia spent as a normal human girl after she gave her Soul Reaper powers to Ichigo until the Soul Society finally found her and brought her back. Taken slightly aback by his brown-haired friend's question, Ichigo narrowed his eyes slightly at him and asked, "And what does Rukia have to do with anything?" "Well, she could at least drop by once in a while and say hi to us. She hasn't done that even once since she left a year ago. Bit cold if you ask me," pointed out Tatsuki, with her eyes closed and her voice somewhat filled with worry towards her former friend. Ichigo then closed his eyes and promptly turned his back on the guardrail before resting it on it and said, "She's not cold. She likely was relieved of her duty to watch over Karakura town." He then paused, reopened his eyes, and with a somewhat melancholic tone, he declared her not coming back here is normal. Said melancholy did not go unnoticed by both Kigo and Tatsuki. With a worried and empathetic look, the former asked him, "You do miss her a lot, don't you?" Only for Ichigo's face to become cold and emotionless. But the two teenagers could also see a tiny hint of sadness in it. "Of course I don't miss her," he declared, while beginning to walk away from them, his left hand in his pocket. "After 16 years I finally get to live my life as a normal human. I hope it stays this peaceful until I die." And with those words he left, leaving Tatsuki and Kigo alone. Many moments of silence passed as the wind flew by, caressing the skin of the two teenagers before Kigo broke it. He didn't truly mean what he just said. "Right, Tatsuki." While getting back on his feet and looking at her with much empathy and despondency. An equally saddened look formed on the lavender-haired teenage girl's face as she lowered her gaze downwards, closed her eyes slightly and replied, "Of course he didn't. No matter how much of a tough guy exterior he puts up, he can't hide it with his voice. He really does miss her a lot." Kigo couldn't help but smile. "You can't really blame him for that. Rukia was such a kind girl. Ever since she came to our school, little by little I saw how Ichigo began to open up and become more cheerful and easygoing thanks to her. And that was before we knew that he had gotten himself into all that scary Soul Reaper stuff," he replied while looking away as a cloud briefly obscured the sun. "Ever since his mother died, he's been unhappy. Yeah, he had us, but he kept the most important part of himself locked up deep inside him. I guess that by becoming a Soul Reaper, getting the power to protect everyone and making so many friends in that so-called Soul Society, little by little, it made him happy." Continued the brown-haired teenager, now staring at the view of Karakura town. "He doesn't just miss her. He misses being a Soul Reaper in general. Ever since Rukia made him one, he's never been happier in his entire life. And look at him now. He doesn't even give a damn about his future. That's how badly losing his powers affected him. He really didn't deserve that after everything he went through to protect us," he concluded while lowering his head downwards, an even more saddened look forming on his face. Tatsuki couldn't help but smile at Kigo's words. He really had come a long way in the last year in spite of still having some goofy tendencies ever since their standoff against the godly Aizen. And like her, he had understood far too well the new melancholy that now troubled their friend. The void left when he lost his ability to see spirits along with his Soul Reaper powers and by extension the young woman who had given him everything. Placing a hand on Kigo's shoulder, causing him to look at her beautiful brown eyes, she kindly spoke, "You really have matured a lot, you know that. Yourself from a year ago would have never said something as insightful as that. The brown-haired teen just looked at her with a slight blush. He didn't know how beautiful she would look when she would act so kindly, instead of just kicking the crap out of anyone who would annoy her and Orihime. Give him time, Ichigo. I know that someday, he will get to see his friends again. I just can't help but have the feeling that things are about to change pretty soon, and she paused after seeing the way Ichigo was staring at her, entranced by her beauty. Why are you looking at me like that? Her voice taking on an awkward tone, matched by her uncomfortable face. With most of his blood rushing to his head, Ichigo declared, "You're so pretty," actually causing her to blush. Before he got on his knees, put his hands together and with stars on his eyes, he exclaimed, "Please be my girlfriend. Let me, Ichigo Asano, protect you as we. In your dreams," she yelled, while slamming the back of her foot on his head, making him hit the floor with his face. That being said, a part of her actually felt charmed by this bold approach. No one had ever tried to hit on her so boldly. However, what little liking of it she had of it disappeared as soon as Ichigo muttered, his face still pressed on the concrete floor, "Wow, it even feels good to be kicked like this." Itsuki sweat dropped. "I take it back, he hasn't changed one bit," she remarked in her mind in disappointment. Ast. Never meant to belong. Original 2004 version equals watch V equals 0532 NBU0C. Later on in the afternoon, as the final lesson ended, Ichigo had taken his bag and had begun to return home. And ever since his earlier conversation with Ichigo and Tatsuki, he couldn't stop thinking back to what they said. And they were right. No matter how much he tried to deny it, he greatly missed Rukia, and not just her but all the friends he made in the Soul Society, and just being a Soul Reaper in general. It's true. Being able to see ghosts never made me feel superior to others. I never thought of making a living out of it by using my unique gift to help people I didn't know. All I ever wanted was a normal life without seeing ghosts. Those were the thoughts that haunted his mind as he once again looked back to everything he did after Rukia gave him his powers. Well, I finally got what I wanted, didn't I? He thought while walking through the school's courtyard, heading home. But deep down it wasn't true. He missed his Soul Reaper friends. He missed Rukia. He missed having the power to protect those he cared about. He had no idea that returning to the normal life he had before meeting Rukia would have left him with such a void in his heart and soul. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't even notice one particular person in front of him. Said person let out a cute oof. After being hit on by him, snapping Ichigo back to reality. And upon seeing who that person was, Ichigo smiled softly and greeted, "Oh, hey Orihime." A beautiful orange-haired teenage girl turned towards him, after gasping cutely, and with her signature sweet smile, greeted back, "Hi Ichigo." And after that, an awkward silence settled in which the two teenagers simply stared at each other. Orihime blushed at the way Ichigo was staring at her until she broke the silence and asked hesitantly, "So, are you doing anything after school today?" Ichigo simply shook his head and gently replied, "No. I'm free as always." "I see." Then replied even more hesitantly the orange-haired girl before she finally mustered the courage and asked him, "Then would you like to walk me home, Ichigo?" While putting her left pointer finger on her lower lip and looking away slightly with another blush. Ichigo smiled tenderly. He always loved how sweet and innocent Orihime was. She always reminded him of her mother, and that was why she liked her so much. The two had started dating lately. Ichigo would often come to her home and they would study together. Orihime even went the extra mile and even cooked for him, or for when he would even bring Uryu and Chad to study with him. Truly, in spite of the harrowing experience of being held captive in Las Noches and all the psychological torture she went through, she moved on with a smile on her face. It mattered not to her at all, for now she and Ichigo had begun to date. He then put his left arm around her shoulders and gently said, "Of course." Showing his kindest side, one he would show to very few people, causing the teenage girl to smile happily. And with that they left, heading for Orihime's house. Ichigo and Orihime were walking through the streets of the city, heading for the latter's house through the shopping district of the city, where many people were either going to work, returning from it, or going shopping. The streets were just as lively as they were in the morning, and even today, there was quite a lot of traffic on the road. "So, how was school today?" asked Orihime, breaking the silence that had settled ever since she and Ichigo left the school. The usual. Uryu being the number one nerd, Ichigo being a goofball as always, teacher Miss Ado being well herself. He casually replied, with a somewhat dry tone, which didn't go unnoticed by the sweet girl. "Still don't know where Chad is. He's really been skipping school a lot lately. I wonder why." He added with a hint of worry for one of his greatest friends. An equally worried look made its way on Orihime's face as she looked at her boyfriend and replied, "I have noticed it too. He says he's found a job lately, but I didn't really get the chance to talk to him. Well, at least he's gonna earn some money. Maybe even enough to move out after he graduates." Speaking of which, he paused before turning towards Orihime and saying, I never quite figured out how you managed to live all alone in your house after your brother passed away. Only for a saddened look to form in the girl's light gray eyes upon recalling the memories of her brother Sora's death. He was everything to her. She and her brother were the victims of abusive parents. They put up with their abuse until Sora finally decided that enough was enough, and before he turned 18, he and then 3-year-old Orihime ran away from them and eventually made their way here on Karakura town. From then on, he made it his duty to raise his younger sister until, tragically, 9 years later, he died after the injuries he sustained in a car crash when Orihime was just 12 years old. After recalling all that happened, she replied, I actually have a distantly related aunt that gave me some money. She agreed to give me more money the higher grades I get. That's how I managed to stay there for the first year. Of course, that was before I met Tatsuki, and afterwards. She paused while stopping and looking at Ichigo in his brown eyes. Ichigo. An equally saddened look made its way on Ichigo's face. He cursed himself for asking her such a question and bringing back all those painful memories. After all, he was there when her brother, having become a hollow after lingering in the world of the living for 3 whole years, came back for her, intending to take her for himself in order to live together once more. It was only because of his intervention that she and Tatsuki didn't lose their lives that night, and eventually Orihime's love for her brother allowed him to momentarily regain control of himself and purify himself with Ichigo's Zanpakuto, after learning that ever since his death, his younger sister had always worn the hairpins he brought her for her 12th birthday. Over which she had an argument with him. Orihime, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. He apologized, looking downwards in guilt for making her relive those memories. To his surprise, however, Orihime reached out for his left cheek with her right hand, caressing it. Looking him in the eyes with affection, she reassured, it's okay. He's in the Soul Society now. And I'm sure he's made his own share of friends there. I'm sure he's happy there. More importantly, she paused before inching her face closer to Ichigo in spite of the blush on her cheeks, causing the orange-haired strawberry's lips to part away upon seeing how beautiful she looked. Her face then took on a look of concern, and she declared, it's you who are unhappy, Ichigo. The teenager shuddered and could only look at her with his eyes slightly wide and his face filled with nothing but dejection. She had him figured out. Like him, she always had a knack for understanding others. Ever since you lost your powers a year ago, you've been like that. I know that you miss Rukia a lot. The rest of us do so too. Back then there was something within you, a blazing fire, an unbreakable iron will. Your faith in me, Uryuchad and the others, was what allowed you to face all those impossible opponents, rescue me and eventually defeat Aizen. She paused, reaching out for his other cheek with her right hand, but now you feel empty because she's disappeared from your life, along with your powers. I know what it feels like to have that unfillable void in your heart, to feel like you don't have anything in spite of your life being otherwise. I felt like that after my brother died. Ichigo was nearly moved to tears by Orihime's words, and from the sadness in her voice, he could tell that she felt the same way he did. She and Rukia were bound by a very deep friendship, a friendship that they consolidated when Rukia took her to the Soul Society and began to train her for the upcoming war against Aizen and his Arankar army. When she left, she too began to miss her. The memories of the time she spent as a human were some of the fondest Orihime looked back to. Though Orihime called out Ichigo, impassioned by the affectionate look the girl was giving him before she smiled passionately and inched her face even closer, her lips only a few centimeters from his. She then declared, ever since I met you, that void in my heart disappeared. So, please Ichigo, let me do the same for you. Let me be the one to protect you after everything you have done for me. Soundtrack ends. Both of them felt their hearts beginning to beat faster as passion and desire began to fill them. However, before Orihime could declare her feelings towards each other, the soccer ball landed close to Ichigo's feet. Both teenagers were pulled out of their passionate moment by it, and Ichigo knelt down and picked it up, looking at it for a few seconds. Then a kid who looked to be no more than 5 years old, wearing an orange shirt and red shoes, came in front of the two teenagers and asked kindly, can I have my ball back, please? Only for a frown to form on Ichigo's face as he looked the kid straight in the eyes and declared, listen kid, try to be more careful next time. There are cars going by that will splatter you on the pavement if you're not careful. He coldly advised, making the kid scared. Only for his fear to turn into awe as Orihime knelt down next to Ichigo in front of it and sweetly said, it's okay. He may look and sound scary, but he actually has a heart of gold deep down. Entrancing the kid. Honestly, he thought he was seeing an angel. And Orihime, funnily enough, began to make a series of funny expressions to entertain the kid. One of them, which unnerved even Ichigo, had Orihime's eyes closed in a way that they resembled the number 3, while her lips were pressed together so much that Ichigo thought she resembled Jin for a moment. She even went as far as extending her tongue out upward slightly, making it look like a triangle. She sure has gotten better at making faces, he internally remarked with a sweat drop, having forgotten her more silly antics. Hahaha. You're so funny. Exclaimed the kid, while pointing at her and laughing cutely. Ichigo smiled at how easily Orihime's kindness and silly antics beamed up that little kid. He then gave back the kid's ball while saying, alright. Now go ahead and get out of here. It's not safe playing soccer around here. Earning a nod from the kid and a smile from Orihime as well. From time to time, he too was capable of being this sweet. And with that, the teenager couple left and began to cross the road once the green light of the traffic light lighted up. However, Ichigo noticed out of the corner of his eye that the kid was still playing on the other side of the road. MMPH. Should have guessed it would have been useless talking some sense into him. Oh well, not my fault if he ends up squashed by a car. Frowned Ichigo to himself in disappointment. But then. The soccer ball suddenly ended up in the middle of the road. The next moment, Ichigo's eyes widened as the kid without a care in the world began to walk right into the road to get it back. Watch out. Don't get on the road. He yelled to no avail, alerting Orihime, who noticed the danger the kid had put himself in. Her eyes widened upon seeing a red car driving much faster than the rest, heading straight towards the kid, not intending to slow down at all. Oh no. I won't be able to move him out of the way with my Shun Rika in time. She panicked in her mind, knowing that, at that distance the car would have been faster, and by the time she had summoned her powers, the kid would have been already dead. Worse, by summoning one of her barriers to protect the kid, the car could have crashed into it, injuring whoever was driving it if not outright killing them. Then the unthinkable happened. Get out of the way! Screamed Ichigo before, without a second of hesitation, he rushed towards the kid, mere moments before the car would hit him and pushed him out of the way. The driver, a man in his 50s accompanied by his wife, was laughing with her when the woman noticed the kid and the teen before them on the road. She screamed, "Look out!" in order to get her husband to stop the car, but it was too late. Orihime could only watch in horror, with her eyes and mouth wide open, as the car struck Ichigo head-on right after he successfully pushed that kid away. His body went limp in an instant due to the force of the impact, and it flew upwards over the car as it finally stopped after 2 more seconds. Time itself seemed to stop as the body of the teen she had developed feelings for flew upwards over the car before crashing on the pavement with a sickening thud. Oddly enough, Ichigo didn't even feel a bit of pain as the car struck him and everything went blissfully dark. Then, a few minutes after, he woke up and sat down while rubbing the back of his head. That's odd. It's as if I was never hit by that car. I don't even feel a bit of pain. He mused to himself, not understanding why he was completely unscathed after being struck by a car. Ejiro. Thank goodness you're okay. Came the voice of a woman that snapped him out of his thoughts. He then turned towards the direction it came from and promptly saw the same kid from earlier, hugged by what he presumed was his mother. Well, at least he's alright, he mused to himself again, this time with a heroic smile. However, that smile disappeared the moment he heard a horrified gasp behind him. He turned around and saw Orihime, looking at him within horror and disbelief, covering her mouth with her hands. Ichigo, she weakly managed to call out, earning a confused look on the strawberry's face. He looked at her quizzically before asking casually, Orihime. Why are you looking at me like that? You look like you've seen a G. Only to stop mid-question upon hearing a metal sound as he got up. His puzzlement turned into shock and horror upon seeing that on his chest, a metal chain was attached onto it. What? He shouted in disbelief, which soon gave way to even more dismay as the moment he reached for that chain with his hands, he noticed that a white aura surrounded them. With his brown eyes trembling and many gasps coming out of his mouth as he looked at his hands in terror, he weakly managed, and no, don't tell me. His fears were confirmed the moment he heard several voices behind him. What a brave young man, he gave his life to save that kid. God bless him. What a tragedy to die at such a young age. It took a whole 10 seconds for Ichigo to muster the strength to turn around and look. He regretted that almost immediately, for as soon as he did, he froze upon seeing several dozen people surrounding the same car that had struck him, while 2 policemen find the car's driver. An ambulance had also arrived. And most importantly, carried by 2 of the ambulance's crew on a stretcher bed was none other than his lifeless body. And as the full realization of what had happened hit him straight on like a truck, Ichigo could only do one thing. Oh, you've gotta be kidding me. He finally screamed in a mix of horror, frustration and bewilderment while clutching the sides of his head with his hands. And just like that, a simple car, driven by a reckless driver, had accomplished what Byakuya Kichiki, Kenpachi Zaraki, the Espadas Grimjo Jijerjax, Noitragilga, Yami Largo and Ulquiorra Cipher, and even Sasuke's himself, all failed to do. Ichigo Kurosaki was dead. But little did he know that this was just the beginning of a new journey. After a few more dozen seconds of just standing there, after screaming in horror and disbelief, Ichigo finally managed to calm down after remembering that while his physical body had died, he still existed as a soul. That's just fucking great. Of all the stupid ways I could have gotten myself killed, it just had to be by getting run over by a car driven by a dumbass of a driver to save an even dumber kid who thought it was a good idea to play here. He snorted in his mind while looking at said driver trying to excuse himself to the policeman and failing miserably while his own body was being carried into the ambulance. Wait, if I did get myself run over by a car, why is it that my body doesn't even have so much as a scratch? He asked to himself as soon as he noticed that detail. He got his answer when Orihime reached out for him with a hand behind him. As soon as he heard her hesitantly call out Ichigo, he turned towards her and with a serious look on his face, he asked her, Orihime, why is my body intact? Did you heal it? Earning a nod from her. I did. But she replied weakly, her eyes already blurring with tears. Ichigo just looked at her with sadness and put his hands on her shoulders and asked her, but what? Why am I still dead? Not understanding why it didn't work on him, given that she had told him that her Sotenkissen could even bring back the dead. For a while Orihime was so broken by what she had discovered in trying to bring back Ichigo that she can't find the strength to tell him. But the orange-haired strawberry got his answer when another feminine voice answered, because in spite of how powerful its ability to reject reality is, there is a limit to our Sotenkissen. It can only bring back souls from the dead. It cannot bring a living human soul back into its former living body, no matter how intact or broken said body is. Ichigo and Orihime then turned towards the orange long-haired girl's right shoulder and saw that standing there was one of the spirits who made her Shun Rika. Shuno, the blonde fairy with light green bat-like wings and legs that wore a Chinese-style red dress with many yellow outlines on its edges. Her eyes were closed, but in spite of that, a look of clear dejection was present on her otherwise always cheerful face. Ast. Nothing can be explained. Shuno called out Orihime, her voice already beginning to crack. And while Ichigo was at first confused by this spirit he had never seen before, and then guessing that it was part of Orihime's Shun Rika, the strawberry's brown eyes immediately widened in dismaying shock at the revelation, and his face turned pale. This meant that he could no longer return back to his living body to his life as a human being. Are you sure? Was all Ichigo could ask the spirit, now clearly visible to him, given that he now was a plus and thus, a spirit as well, his voice becoming dry and weak, while Orihime's tears finally began to fall from her eyes. At the same time, dark clouds had begun to form all around the sky, covering it and preventing the light of the sun from shining through. Shuno simply nodded in sadness and answered, it can be said that humans mostly live by destroying. In the midst of all that, you could say that Orihime's power is kinder than anything else. She then paused, looking downwards with even more sadness making its way on her face before she finally declared, but once a human dies, no, once any type of living being leaves its former living body, it will never be able to return to it, for it now belongs to a new existence, one that is no longer bound by the natural forces of the world of the living. And no power in the universe will ever be able to turn an astral being back to a living being. I'm sorry, Ichigo. As Shuno faded away back into part of Orihime's hairpin, the orange-haired girl couldn't take it anymore. She buried her head on his chest and broke down in tears while uttering the name of the teen she had developed feelings for, her voice having cracked completely. Ichigo. The orange-haired strawberry shuddered and also began to cry, having finally realized that there was no turning back. He will never be a living human anymore. He would have never graduated after school, find a job and a home all for himself, marry a woman and have children. His life as a human had come to an end. As his tears could no longer be kept back, he hugged Orihime back as the long-haired girl weakly managed her cries. I'm so sorry after everything we have been through, after all we shared, it's not fair. She screamed in grief, her voice utterly broken. She was overcome by joy when she brought him back from death after Ulquiorra blasted a hole in his chest with his Zero Oscuras. And now a single car had managed to do what arguably the most powerful of all the Espadas had almost accomplished, were it not for Orihime's powers to reject reality. No, Orihime, you have nothing to be sorry for, it was my fault, all of it. If I hadn't jumped in to save that kid, I weakly muttered Ichigo as he held the beautiful teenage girl in his arms, ignoring the stares of all the people around them as most, if not all of them, couldn't see him, and simply dismissed Orihime as expressing her grief. The same self-loathing he felt when his mother died, and he blamed himself for it for 6 whole years before he found out that the Hollow Grand Fisher was the one responsible, had now returned. Because of him, his friends would have never seen him again, including her. All because he had given away his life to save a little kid. But how couldn't he? Ever since his mother died on that fateful day, Ichigo vowed that he would protect anyone. And it was through that desire that he became a Soul Reaper, faced all of the Soul Society to save Rukia, and journeyed through Wako Mundo and into Aizen's fortress, Las Noches, to save Orihime. He couldn't stand aside and let that kid's life be abruptly cut short just when it was about to begin. However, this time, by doing so, he had given away his life. No, it can't end like this, not after everything we did to make sure Rukia, Orihime and all of Karakura town would be safe, sorrowfully mused in his mind Ichigo, heartbroken that this time, he will be the one who will leave his friends and his alone. Wait. Since he was now a soul, no longer bound by his mortal body and thus he could see other spirits clearly. It means I can finally become a soul reaper again, he realized, recalling how he regained his powers after Byakuya sealed the powers Rukia had given him when she stabbed him with her own Zanpakuto by cutting his chain of fate during their first encounter. How after regaining his spirit energy after fighting with that young girl Yoru, which was anything but harmless, his chain was cut by Tessai and he was dropped into a 60-meter tall hole in the center of Kisuke's training field, his arms bound by a Bakuto spell and forced through an accelerated 72-hour-long version of the encroachment. The inevitable process of losing the chain and thus becoming a hollow when a plus lingers in the world of the living for too long or gives into despair. Luckily, Ichigo managed to awaken in his inner world, meet the spirit of his Zanpakuto, Zangetsu, and acquire his true Soul Reaper powers that always lied dormant within him, powers that for some unknown reason, he always possessed. And now he could get them back by going through that process again. But before he could do that, there was one thing he needed to do. One conversation he had to have with his father before he would proceed with his quest to regain his powers. A conversation that had to be postponed after Aizen would be defeated. Having finally decided, he pulled himself out of Orihime's arms, put his hands on her shoulders, and with a determined look, he spoke. Orihime, I know what I have to do. But first we have to go to my house and talk with my dad. I promised to have an important conversation with him as soon as the right time would come. Well, that time is now. Orihime at first didn't understand what Ichigo meant. Nonetheless, she nodded and replied, alright then. Let's go before it gets dark. She paused, knowing full well the vulnerable position the recently deceased teenager was in and before some hollows come. And with one last nod from Ichigo, the two began to make their way to the orange spiky-haired Strawberry's house. But unfortunately, something was already watching them. It didn't take long for Ichigo's family to find out what had happened. Karen was hanging out with her friends when the sky suddenly became covered with clouds and some sounds of thunder began to arrive. Thus, she was reluctantly forced to return home before the first droplets of the rain would come down. And as soon as she opened the door of her home, Nuo, Ichiguo, came a pained scream of grief and sorrow from her older sister. Alerted, Karen immediately rushed to the living room and promptly saw Yuzu with many tears freely falling out of her closed eyes, incomprehensible cries being the only sounds that left her mouth. Her father, Isen, cradled her in his arms with a solemn and equally saddened look as they both lied on their knees on the floor. Not understanding at first what was going on, Karen asked hesitantly, Dad. Yuzu? What happened? Isen looked at her in the eyes and for the first time in who knows how long, she saw a look so serious and solemn that it caused her eyes to widen and her lips to part in surprise. She found it hard to believe that her own dad, possibly the goofiest person she had ever known, was the one giving it. He then simply said, see for yourself, while pointing his head to the TV. After a few seconds, Ichigo's younger sister managed to take a look at the screen. And the moment she did, she froze. On the screen, a live broadcast was shown of a car having crashed on the left sidewalk of the road into a wall. It was covered by many people, including an ambulance and its crew, several policemen, who had put a yellow tape around the side of the crash, while two of them find the owners of the car that were responsible for the accident. And most importantly, on the bottom of the TV screen, the news report read, dramatic car crash in the Hirayaku Avenue. 17-year-old teenager confirmed dead. And a reporter, a man in its late 30s in a suit with short black hair and brown eyes, stated, as can be confirmed in the various reports of the witnesses, the orange-haired teenager selflessly jumped in the middle of the street to push a 5-year-old kid away before the car that can be seen behind me could run him over. Mere words are not enough to express this selfless act of heroism. Our hearts go to this young man who gave up his life without a bit of hesitation to save another one, 12 years younger than his. May he rest in peace. And as the reporter was finishing his speech, she saw the lifeless body of her older brother being carried away by the ambulance's crews. Then a photo of him was shown in the broadcast. And with that, the world around Karen began to fall apart all at once. And no, it can't be true, she weakly muttered, while falling on her knees, the rest of her body limp from the shock and horror. She refused to believe it. She refused to believe that her brother had died. But no matter how much she tried to deny it, it was exactly what had happened. But before she could scream her grief, she remembered. Wait a moment, when people die, they turn into ghosts. That means, she thought, her eyes widening upon realizing that her brother was not completely gone, that now Ichigo exists as a soul. She had to find him. She had to find him before hollows would come and eat him. With a resolute look forming on her face, she spoke Dad. Earning Isen's attention along with her younger sisters. I'm going out. Ichigo is still alive somewhere. I have to find him. But while Yuzu couldn't understand what her younger sister meant, as Karen began to run past her father, who was still comforting her crying older sister in his arms, Isen suddenly ordered sharply, "That's out of the question, Karen." While letting go of Yuzu, getting up and grabbing Karen by her left arm, stopping her in her tracks. "Look, I know you're grief-stricken due to how sudden all of this happened, but there's nothing we can do. Ichigo's gone and we have to accept it," he declared, his voice filled with nothing but dejection, and his face filled with so much seriousness that Yuzu couldn't believe that her own dad was saying it. Karen screamed in grief, "Let me go. I have to find him." She paused, for the first time ever since she somehow received the memories of that kid Yuchi Shibata, trapped in the body of the parakeet, and begged her brother to end his pain, on the verge of crying. The pain and grief of when her mother died returned all at once. And now Ichigo had died too. But she wasn't going to abandon him, even if he was now nothing more than a spirit. Soundtrack ends. The sound of the doorbell ringing prevented her from continuing to plead to her dad to let her go. After a few seconds of silence that seemed like an eternity, Karen seized the distraction to free herself from her dad's grip, immediately scrambled to third door. And as soon as she opened it, a lighting suddenly struck nearby, illuminating what stood in front of Karen, and her heart sank. In front of her stood her older brother, now a ghost. Besides him was his friend from high school, Orihime. She thought her eyes were deceiving her, that this was nothing more than a cruel joke. But she was in for one massive reality check, and her jaw dropped as soon as her brother, with a faint smile, greeted "Hi, Karen," before looking towards Isen and adding with melancholy, "Dad Yuzu." Karen couldn't find the strength to speak. Instead, with her face still contorted in shock, she called out Ichigo. And as the spirit of her brother, only hours from having died, smiled tenderly at her, the raven-haired girl couldn't take it anymore. Tears of joy and sadness began to leave her eyes for the first time in ages, and then she screamed Ichigo. And promptly hugged her deceased older brother, burying her head into his abdomen. Ichigo immediately wrapped his arms around his younger sister, while Orihime looked on with a kind smile at the display of affection being shared by the two siblings. Given how much the orange-haired teenager acted so tough most of the time, she was positively surprised to see just how truly sweet and affectionate he could be to his family. It also made her even more sad that she would have never been able to see him like this. But then, Ichigo called out Isen, disbelief and surprise present all over his face. Yuzu immediately got up and with a puzzled expression on her face asked Dad. What's going on? However, her bewilderment was nothing compared to the look of pure shock that made its way on Karen's face as she gasped, turned towards her dad, and weakly managed to stammer, "Dad, you can see him too." Not believing what was happening, while even Orihime's face filled with great surprise at the reveal that Ichigo's dad could also see ghosts. Just as Isen was about to reply, his son beat him to it. "Dad, remember that conversation I told you about? The one we agreed to have when the time would be right?" he asked him, causing his father's face to turn pale upon recalling that day, a year ago when his son agreed to have him tell him his whole story and why he kept what he truly was from him all this time for another day. They had agreed to have that conversation once Isen would be defeated. "Well, that time is now," finally declared Ichigo, his voice serious and earnest. A calm and solemn look formed on Isen's face, one he hadn't shown ever since their climatic battle against Aizen. Ever since that fateful day, 17 years earlier, he tried to keep his family out of the world of hollows and soul reapers. For all those years he tried to keep them safe. But he knew far too well that this moment was destined to come. And that even Karen was involved in it. Thus, a reluctant Isen nodded and replied, "All right then, my son. I think the time has come for you and your sisters to know the truth. All of it." Earning a concerned look from Yuzu and one of contemplation and understanding from Karen. At the same time it finally began to rain all around the city. And so the entirety of the Kurosaki family, plus Orihime, gathered in the living room. Ichigo, his sisters and Orihime all sat on the couch, while Isen grabbed a nearby chair and put it down in front of said couch. After a few moments of silence, he cleared out his throat and began, "I guess I can start by showing you this." Orihime and Karen's eyes widened and their jaws dropped as Isen's body briefly became enveloped in an orange-colored aura before, with an ethereal sound, his soul left his living body, briefly connected by 4 tendrils of white energy which soon gave away. His living body fell on the chair and right in front of them, Ichigo's father now stood tall and proud, noticeably more muscular than in his living body, wearing the standard black uniform of the Soul Reapers called Shihakusho, along with a tattered white coat worn like a sash and fastened over his left shoulder. On his left side, carried on a string wrapped around his belt in an Edo style, was what looked like an ordinary tachi with a red handle and hexagonal tsuba, in reality his zanpakuto, in Jetsu. Mr. Kurosaki was all Orihime could manage, not believing that even Ichigo's dad was a Soul Reaper just like him. At all this time you were, stammered Karen, even more shocked than Orihime was. Her brother's serious expression on the other hand didn't change in the slightest, for he had already seen his father like that. Yuzu on the other hand wasn't understanding what happened, as to her eyes her father appeared to have suddenly passed out. However, Issen, upon noticing the confusion on his older daughter and realizing that he might as well go along with it, said, I might as well as do this, given that at this point there's no turning back. And simply released his spiritual pressure, which was surprisingly immense yet at the same time soothing and warm. Nonetheless, it was so immense that Orihime, Karen and for a moment even Ichigo felt overwhelmed by it. Ichigo tensed up for a while, realizing that this spiritual pressure was just as powerful as those of Kenpachi and Byakuya. Could it be? Before he could come up with the explanation for this, Yuzu felt something soothing and radiant pass through her body. It felt nice, like the warm water of a hot spring. She then gasped in surprise, blinked twice and called out hesitantly, Dad. Now seeing him perfectly as a Soul Reaper due to having come in contact with his powerful spiritual pressure. Ichigo, Orihime and Karen all turned towards the strawberry's older sister, who was looking in awe at her dad, now more muscular and clad in the standard Soul Reaper uniform. Yuzu, you can see him? Asked hesitantly Karen, stupefied that her older sister now could clearly see souls just like her. Yuzu slowly nodded, turned towards her younger sister, and replied, I think so. I think it has to do with what he did just now, only to stop upon seeing that between her and Orihime, there was the ghost of her big brother. With a joyful smile, she called out, Ichigo, my brother, with unbridled affection and happiness. She was overjoyed to see him again. He wasn't gone. He still existed as a soul. Ichigo smiled softly at her sister, finally having acquired the ability to see spirits, thanks to what her father just did. Issen then confirmed Yuzu's theory by stating, by coming in contact with my spiritual energy, you've now become spiritually aware, Yuzu, just like your brother and sister. That means you can now see souls. Causing his son and daughters along with Orihime to all turn back towards him, a solemn and serious look returning on Ichigo's face. Yuzu, still in awe at her father's appearance, hesitantly asked, Dad, what are you? Without saying a word, Issen took his living body from the chair, laid it on the ground and took his seat on it. With his hands clasped together, he replied, guess I'll start from the beginning. Finally beginning his speech while all of his children and Orihime listened. You may know me as your father, Issen Kurosaki, local surgeon of the Kurosaki Clinic, formerly married to your mother, Masaki Kurosaki, but I was never born in this world. He stated, causing Karen and Yuzu's eyes to widen slightly while Ichigo and Orihime simply listened, their expression not changing at all. I was born in a place called the Soul Society. Long story short, it's the plane of the afterlife in which all souls come after they have died in the world of the living, and where they live for the rest of their existence, until they eventually die, and are reincarnated back in the world of the living, as people with no past memories of their previous life. The flow of souls in and out of the Soul Society is instrumental in maintaining the balance of the world, and it is the duty of us, Soul Reapers, to protect those souls, and by extension, that balance, by allowing them to pass unharmed to the Soul Society. To Ichigo, Orihime and to a lesser extent, Karen, all of that was nothing new. Even Karen had eventually learned about the nature of Soul Reapers, given that she had in fact met none other than the captain of Squad 10, Toshiro Hitsugaya. Yuzu, on the other hand, was extremely fascinated at the reveal that their world was interconnected to an astral one, where all people would eventually go upon dying and turning into souls. With so many questions pounding her head, she asked her father, so you've always been a Soul Reaper, Dad? Issen simply nodded and continued, yeah. Because I was born in one of the noble families as the firstborn of a new generation, I was bound by duty to become one. So I. Wait a moment, interrupted Ichigo, his face suddenly filling with surprise, you're telling me that all this time, you were of noble blood just like Byakuya? Causing Karen and Yuzu to look at their father in puzzlement. Issen, bracing himself for what was about to come, inhaled slightly before replying, you mean, Captain Kichiki, right? Earning a nod from Ichigo, who was in for quite the surprise when Issen continued, yeah. As a matter of fact, Kurosaki was never my real surname. It was one I adopted when I left the Soul Society. I was born as Issen Shiba, and at the time I was the head of the Shiba clan. The look of pure shock on Ichigo and Orihime's faces had to be seen to be believed. They knew that surname very well. It belonged to the ones who helped them infiltrate the Sirte when they went to the Soul Society to rescue Rukia. The Dad, you mean, was all Ichigo could manage, his mouth agape and his eyes shaking in disbelief. That Ganju and Kukaku, finished Orihime, just as thunderstruck as the orange-haired strawberry, remembering all too well the hot-tempered but loyal and courageous man who fought at their side against the many Soul Reapers to save Rukia, and his more temperamental but ultimately easygoing and beaming sister, who propelled them towards the Sirte with her cannon of hers that she used mostly for fireworks. With a smile briefly crossing his lips, Isin confirmed what little doubts they had by chuckling and saying, "Hey, you've met them too, have you?" "Yeah, Ganju and Kukaku are my younger brother and sister. I also had another brother named Kain, but unfortunately he died when a powerful hollow named Metastasia wrought havoc on the 13th squad, the one of which he was its lieutenant." His smile leaving his lips upon recalling the death of his brother and how he can't do anything to prevent it due to him not being present in the Soul Society at the time, instead fulfilling several duties in the world of the living. An even more shocked Ichigo then interjected, nearly exclaiming, "The 13th squad? You mean, the one Rukia is assigned to?" And nearly getting up from the couch. Isin, with another nod, replied, "Yeah. Back then, 20 years ago, there weren't just 4 great noble families. There were 5, and the Shiba clan was one of them before it fell from grace due to both the death of my brother Kain and my disappearance happening at the same time." Surprising Ichigo by just how somber he sounded. It dawned on him that it must have been very hard for him to just return from his duties in the world of the living only to learn that he had just lost his brother. Karen and Yuzu were left utterly speechless. All this time, their father had been a high-ranking noble, on top of being a soul reaper. Not only that, but they had an uncle and an aunt all along. "So all this time, we had an uncle and an aunt and you never told us?" dumbfoundedly asked Karen. His father gave her a smile and replied, "They would have loved to have met you. You and Kukaku in particular are almost 2 peas in a pod. You would be surprised to see just how aggressive she can be." While chuckling as many fond memories of his time spent with his family returned. "Then why did you leave them, Dad? You did love them with all of your heart, didn't you?" suddenly asked Ichigo with his usual stern face, wanting to know what could have possibly have motivated his dad to leave something as important as his own family. With much guilt returning for his fateful decision 20 years ago, Isin looked down towards the floor and replied, "I did. They meant everything to me. But due to some unfortunate and unforeseen circumstances, I was forced to make a choice. And by doing so, I sacrificed my very own existence as a soul reaper." His voice becoming somber. Everyone else in the room looked at him in great surprise and puzzlement in a silence that seemed to last for an hour. Eventually, Ichigo broke it. "Dad, what happened?" he asked, wanting to know the whole story. Never in his whole life had Isin expected that it would hurt so much to recall his past once more, to reveal to all of his children that he had lied to them his entire life. But that time had come and there was nothing more he could have done to keep all of this away from his family anymore. Resolving to finally tell his son and daughters everything, Isin looked Ichigo straight in his brown eyes that he inherited from his mother and replied, "There is one more thing you need to know, Ichigo. I wasn't just any ordinary soul reaper." He paused while taking his white haori off his shoulder and showing it to his son. "I used to be a captain. More precisely, I used to be the captain of Squad 10 all those years ago." Ichigo's face went pale at the revelation and his jaw dropped in bewilderment. Just when he thought nothing would have shocked him more than the reveal that all this time, he was of noble blood, just like Byakuya. And all at once, he remembered a certain white-haired boy and a certain orange-haired beautiful woman, renowned among the entirety of the Sirte for her pretty big breasts. Then Toshiro and Ranjiku was all he could manage, his eyes shaking in disbelief and his mouth hanging wide open. Karen looked first at her brother and then at her father in shock, quickly connecting the dots, while an equally surprised Orihime's eyes widened upon realizing that Ichigo's father knew Ranjiku, the female soul reaper that had been so nice to her. To the point that she even enjoyed the food she made. "Dad, you know Toshiro?" asked Karen, just as dumbstruck as her brother. She did in fact meet the young captain of Squad 10 when he was stationed in Karakura town, in charge of a small group of high-ranking soul reapers to deal with any immediate rancor threat. She was actually quick to befriend him, even managing to convince him to play in her soccer team against a group of older teenagers whom they had challenged to play in their usual soccer field after they stole it from them. He even revealed himself as a soul reaper before her own eyes and defended her from a hollow that attacked her and her friends after said game had been won by them thanks to the young captain's help. Ichigo immediately turned towards his younger sister and asked her in surprise, "You've met him?" Earning a nod from Karen, who then replied with a smile, "Why yeah. He was so nice to me and my friends in spite of his tough guy attitude. We even played soccer together and he even protected me and my friends from a hollow." The orange-haired teenager was even more amazed. This was something that he would have never guessed would have happened. His sister actually befriending a captain from the Soul Society. Not only that, but she was speaking very highly of him, thinking of him back as a friend. All of a sudden, his appreciation for the young captain had grown even more. He definitely owned the white-haired young captain, some thanks for what he did for his sister. "Yeah. At the time he was the 3rd seat of the squad and Ranjiku was my lieutenant. He was like a son to me. He always had this sense of loyalty and devotion to his comrades and he was always willing to do others' work without a second thought." Confirmed Isin with a smile, recalling the fond memories of the time he spent with him, and happy to know that after all this years he had become such a caring and selfless young man. I always knew that he had what it takes to be a captain. And I'm glad that. He was abruptly interrupted when Ichigo suddenly stood up, to Orihime and his sister's surprise, rounded his eyes on his father's, and demanded, then why did you leave them? They were your comrades. You cared about them the same way you cared about your family. How could you just? Only for Isin to rise back on his feet, look at him in his eyes with an even more serious look, and interject, because I had no choice. Raising his voice a little, to this day, I still carry many regrets for what happened all those years ago. Look, allow me to explain everything, then you're free to yell at me as much as you want, okay? He asked his son, who after a few moments of silence, nodded. Asked. Never meant to belong. Original 2004 version. Isin then finally began again. It all started one day 20 years ago. At the time, many members of my squad had begun to disappear in the area they were in charge in, Naruki City, which lies not far from here. Against the wishes of Ranjiku and Toshiro, I went there to investigate on my own. And it wasn't too long before I found out who the culprit was. A hollow, a very unusual one named White, who. What's a hollow? Asked Yuzu, interrupting her dad mid-speech. Seeing the confusion in the girl's face, Orihime was quick to answer her. See, it works like this. When people die they become spirits, but not all of them are lucky enough to be found and sent to the Soul Society. If a person's ghost remains in the human world for too long or loses its heart to despair or regret, they inevitably turn into monstrous creatures, driven only by the desire to eat other souls. My brother unfortunately suffered this fate, she explained, her voice eventually filling with sadness upon recalling what happened to her brother. Yuzu, Karen, Ichigo and even Isin looked at Orihime with much sadness and pity. They can't even imagine how she must have felt, seeing her own brother turning into a monster. Ichigo's orange-haired sister was appalled by that reveal. She suddenly felt much empathy for the orange-haired teenage girl. So she put one of her petite hands on top of Orihime's right one, and hesitantly said, I'm sorry to hear that, Orihime. I can't imagine how it must have been for you, to watch your own brother turning into a monster. Orihime merely wrapped her left arm around Yuzu's shoulders and pulled her close while smiling sweetly at her. It's okay. He's in the Soul Society now. Ichigo was the one who sent him there. Causing both Yuzu and Karen to look at him first in surprise and then in awe and admiration, realizing that since he became a Soul Reaper, he had helped many people. But before they could ask him more of his time as a Soul Reaper, Ichigo spoke up. Yeah, and we can talk more about all the things I did as a Soul Reaper later. He paused, turning his gaze back to his father. Right now, there's more important things we need to know. Sorry for the interruption, Dad, we're where you left at. Inside, Isin was happy to see how much more polite his son had become. He guessed it was due to all the battles he went through and all the friends he made, which taught him to be more humble. Nonetheless, he began where he left after saying thanks, Ichigo. As I was saying, the one behind all those disappearances was a hollow named White, a very powerful one, easily of the Vasto Lord class. But it was no ordinary hollow. It was one Aizen created. And in a repeat of what happened with the reveal that Isin was the brother of Ganju and Kukaku, and the reveal that he was the captain of Squad 10, Ichigo and Orihime's faces filled with shock as they had hoped to never hear that name again, while Yuzu and Karen simply listened. As it turned out, Aizen created that hollow from the souls of several Soul Reapers by using his Hijoku and promptly unleashed it on the Soul Reapers guarding Naruki City to see how powerful it was. Eventually, I was able to defeat it after a grueling battle, but in the process I had been critically injured, and because of those injuries, to this day, I still can't use my Bankai without putting severe stress on my body. Continued Isin, while exposing his right shoulder and revealing a scar that ran throughout his whole shoulder from front to back and onto his chest, causing Yuzu and Karen to gasp in shock. They, along with Ichigo and Orihime, had no idea that their own father had been through such a violent ordeal. I would have died for certain that day, had it not been for a young, spiritually aware woman that saw me, mere moments away from being obliterated by that hollow zero. Without a second thought, this woman, having no other powers aside from her ability to see spirits, put herself in between and shoved that hollow away before it could fire the blast that would have ended my life. She was injured in the process, but the distraction she gave me was all I needed to finish the hollow off. Ichigo and his sister's eyes and lips widened in disbelief, not believing what they were hearing. But their suspicions were proven correct when Isin finally declared that woman was Masaki, your mother. And with that, all at once, Ichigo, Yuzu and Karen stopped breathing for a few seconds. You could have heard a fly buzzing in the next room. Such was the silence that settled in as all three of Isin's children and to a lesser extent, Orihime, let all of what their father revealed sink in. That was all Ichigo could manage, not managing to breathe normally for a few seconds due to how much of a bombshell this last reveal was. That's how you and Mom met. Hesitantly asked Yuzu while Karen had been so shocked that she couldn't even speak. A soothing smile made its way on the former captain of Squad 10 as he replied, "Yeah. She even took me to her house, healed my wounds and allowed me to rest there for a night." Masaki was such a kind and brave woman in spite of being no more than a spiritually aware human. Even though she had never met me, without a second thought, she latched onto that hollow, pushing it away and giving me the chance to finish it off. That day is one I will forever cherish for the rest of my life. Awe and admiration filled every inch of Ichigo, Yuzu, Karen and Orihime's faces. They had no idea of what a brave and selfless woman their mother was. I guess that's where I got my desire to protect everyone if mom did that for someone she didn't even know, mused in his mind, Ichigo, now even more happy to have had her as his mother and more regretful that she could never see the young man he had become now. He was pulled out of his thoughts by Isin stating, "The next day I returned to the Soul Society, but as it turned out, it wasn't the end of it. Some days later, I decided to return to the world of the living without authorization to see your mother again, as I had taken a great liking to her after everything she did for me. I was completely unprepared for what I would be faced with." He then paused, looking towards the floor again, remaining silent for a few seconds before finally mustering the strength to continue. "I discovered that the hollow I faced several days ago not only was capable of transmitting a venom that induced holification in its victims, but was also capable of entering the souls of other individuals and fusing with them, due to it being encompassed by the souls of Soul Reapers. And as it turned out, Masaki had been infected by its venom. So I took her to Kisuke's shop and..." "What? Our mother knew that merchant?" suddenly asked Karen, taken completely by surprise by what her father said, and to a lesser extent, even Ichigo was surprised to learn that his mother was acquainted with the same man who taught him how to fight. Isin nodded and answered his younger daughter's question. "Yeah, we both were acquainted with Mr. Urahara. He actually used to be a Soul Reaper captain before he was exiled in the world of the living after being unjustly framed for crimes he didn't actually commit by Aizen. But that's a story for another day," causing a look of great surprise to form on Karen and Yuzu, and to a lesser extent, on Ichigo and Orihime's faces. The former substitute Soul Reaper had in fact been told by Yoruichi that Kisuke used to be the captain of Squad 12, but she never told him why he was exiled. Unless Shinji and the Wizards called it be. He mused in his mind, recalling how the group of former Soul Reapers with hollow powers first taught him to master his holification, and then intervened in the battle against Aizen and his Espadas. It was there that he learned of their grudge against Aizen. Perhaps they were exactly the reason why Kisuke ended up being exiled. He put his thoughts aside for the moment, as right now there were more important things to learn. So he remained silent as his father continued to recall what happened. As I was saying, Masaki had been infected by White's venom and she was undergoing holification, an uncontrollable process in which the soul of a hollow is poured into a normal soul, thus destroying the boundary that normally exists between them. The final outcome of holification is the death of the original soul, as it destroys itself in what is called soul suicide. In other words, if that had been left unchecked, your mother would have turned into a hollow, into nothing more than a monster without any sense of reason. Karen and Yuzu could only look at their father with horror in their eyes and their lips apart, not believing that their own mother came close to turning into one of those monstrous creatures that feed off other people's souls. Even Orihime and Ichigo shuddered slightly at what Isin said. The former could only imagine how painful such a process must have been. It would have been no different from the ordeal her brother, Sora, went through. The only way to counter holification, as Urahara found out, was to pour something into the infected soul that would have countered the process, something much stronger than a normal human soul. A strong conflicting power that would have always remained to her side had to be used, and by doing so, she would have remained human until the day she would have died. In this case, my Soul Reaper powers continued to explain Isin, causing Ichigo and Orihime's eyes to widen even more as soon as he spoke the last phrase. "Dad, you mean," began Ichigo, his voice trembling as he began to realize what had happened. His doubts were confirmed when his father, with a solemn look, declared, "Yes, Ichigo. I sacrificed my Soul Reaper powers, pouring them into Masaki's soul, and by doing so, I was able to stop her holification and link White's soul to that of your mother. As a result, my soul became enclosed in a special Gigai that Kisuke made for me, essentially transforming me into a human. Thanks to him and Masaki's help, I eventually settled in the world of the living, opened up my clinic, and the rest is history." For what seemed like hours, Ichigo and his sisters just stared at his father in a mix of complete shock, disbelief and awe. He couldn't believe that he had done something so selfless to save a woman that he had never met before. But in doing so, suddenly his awe gave way to anger and, with a scowl, he suddenly stood up, to the surprise of everyone else present, and began, "Dad," his voice far from happy as he walked towards Isin and suddenly picked him up by his black kozode and exclaimed, "How could you do such a thing?" causing Orihime, Karen and Yuzu to gasp in surprise at his reaction. Ichigo called out Orihime, worried and saddened at the same time by what was probably going on in his mind at all this information being revealed to him. You had a brother and a sister. You had people who followed you, who believed in you. And you just abandoned them without even saying goodbye to Shiro and Ranjiku were one thing, but how could you do this to Kukaku and Ganju after they had just lost their other brother? He yelled at him, feeling betrayed by the revelation that by staying with the woman he had fallen in love with, his father had abandoned the ones who knew him ever since he was little. Ganju may have been an idiot, and Kukaku had a fiery temper to be sure, but in the end they were good people, and they didn't deserve to be suddenly abandoned by their older brother. Yuzu and Karen both got up from the couch as Issen at first averted his gaze from Ichigo's eyes and replied with a saddened tone, yes, I don't deny that it was very hard for me to leave the people I used to call family behind after all the good things I shared with them. He then paused, looking his son in his eyes and asking him one important question, but let me ask you this, Ichigo. Why is it that you faced all of the Soul Society with just your friends to save Rukia? Causing Ichigo's eyes to widen along with his lips. So taken aback was he with that question that he let his father go and lowered his head downwards, his eyes staring on the floor. He knew. He knew that he would have gone to the Soul Society to rescue her the night before when he gave him that lucky charm. Finally managing to muster the strength to reply, he spoke, because I owed her everything, she gave me the strength to protect the ones I loved. If not for her, Karen and Yuzu would have. Ichigo's younger sisters gasped, their eyes widening in realization. All this time, both on that night and when they went to visit their mother's grave more than a year ago. Ichigo, it was you, spoke Yuzu in awe as she walked towards her older brother, stopping on his left. Ichigo with a tender smile, nodded, and thus, an overjoyed Yuzu hugged him deeply, heartwarmed that he was the one who protected them on both occasions. So that's how you became a Soul Reaper, she gave you that powers, remarked Karen as he came close to her sister who was still hugging Ichigo. At the same time, as Orihime had also stood up, Issen interjected, it's more complicated than that. A lot more complicated than that. Earning Ichigo and the others' attention, Rukia did transfer her powers to you when you pierced your heart with her Zanpakuto, but those were never your own powers. You inherited your true Soul Reaper powers from me, but because of the seal I had placed on Masaki, they never awoke even after she died. But they were not the only ones that laid dormant within you, ever since you were born. The puzzled look made its way on Ichigo's face as Orihime went to his side and he asked his father in perplexity, what do you mean, only to gasp in shock as he realized what Issen was talking about. Looking at him in the eyes once more, Ichigo barely managed to utter, no, you can't possibly mean, while his sisters and the orange-haired teenage girl looked at him in concern. Only for Issen to nod, a serious and solemn look forming on his face. Yes, my son. When I sealed off White, we thought it was the end of it, but as it turned out, as soon as your mother became pregnant with you, the hollow continued with its drive to infect others, so it was transferred from her soul to yours. Luckily, since at the time you were a newborn, your soul was malleable, and thus it was able to accept any type of foreign spiritual energy without the risk of soul suicide. That and the seal I placed on Masaki was transferred along with it, so you were never at risk of turning into a hollow. That was until Captain Kichiki severed your chain of fate during your first battle with him, and as a result, when you acquired your true Soul Reaper powers, the hollow inside you was released. In other words, you never acquired your hollow powers by accident. You were born with them. He explained, causing Ichigo, Orihime and his sister's eyes to widen in pure horror and incredulity. The former two realized that when Ulquiorra had almost killed Ichigo and Orihime tried as much as she could to heal him, it was at that time that he completely lost control of himself and fully turned into a hollow. Then that means that when I tried to heal him after Ulquiorra blasted a hole in the chest, I unwillingly fully turned him into a hollow. Into nothing more than a mindless beast. She mused to herself in her mind, the full reveal of what she had done that day, sinking in fully. Because of that, Ichigo nearly killed Uryu that day after he mortally wounded Ulquiorra. She was now grateful that the fourth Espada had actually managed to break his mask before such a thing could happen. Eren and Yuzu were gaping wide at what they heard. It made them shiver that their older brother had nearly turned into one of those monstrous creatures. They were relieved to know that his willpower and the love for his friends was enough for him to overcome that dark influence on his soul. She was pulled out of her thoughts when Issen finally concluded, and once the seal was broken, my powers slowly began to return. You know how things went after that. Ichigo looked towards the ground for a few moments as he finally came to grips with all his father said ever since this conversation began. Orihime simply looked at him in concern before gently placing her soft left hand on his shoulder. Oh, Ichigo, she mused to herself in dejection. She can't blame him for reacting like that, given that his father had kept all of this hidden from him for his entire life. Why, Dad? Asked Karen, looking at her father with a look of both hurt and sorrow, pulling Ichigo and Orihime out of their thoughts, while Yuzu looked at her younger sister with an equally dejected face. Why have you never told us all of this? Why did you try to convince us that seeing ghosts was just our imagination? In response, an equally saddened and remorseful Isin looked at his youngest child and replied because kids should never see the battlefield. They should be playing and making friends with others, discover the world, know nothing but happiness and love before they grow up. His brown eyes beginning to shake as the memories of his childhood began to come back. I was taught how to fight ever since I was younger than both you and your sister. Such was the tradition for the noble families of the Soul Society. Their firstborns would be trained at a young age to master all of the fighting styles of the Soul Reapers and join one of the 13 court guard squads and soon be sent off to fight hollows and risk their lives on a daily basis. His face hardened as he recalled I hated being a noble. Always surrounded by smug-ass, arrogant dickheads who acted like they owned everything around them including other people who would lead their entire lives to serve them. People who looked down on others who didn't have their luxury, always referring to them as lowly commoners simply because everything was handed to them on a silver plate ever since they were born. Causing Ichigo's eyes to fill with pity towards his father, along with those of Karen and Yuzu, at the resentment that radiated from his words. Unlike him, he never got the choice to choose to fight for what he believed in. No, his father had been forced to fight ever since he was younger than him by the rules of his clan and by extension, by the rules of the Soul Society. As he then looked at his daughters, shaking as the grief of Masaki's death came back with full force, Isin declared surely, you can understand why I wanted to keep you out of that world, do you? It was your mother's wish. She wanted you to live a happy and peaceful life. His eyes beginning to shake, blurring with tears, I have no regrets for what I did for her all those 20 years ago. I owed Masaki my life and there was no way in hell I would have allowed anything to happen to her because she just so happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time on that night. The only thing I've always regretted, he finally declared as he closed his eyes, his tears finally flowing freely, is not being able to save Masaki that night, 7 years ago. And with those words, Ichigo's heart finally sank as he understood everything. He couldn't do anything to prevent his mother's death. His father blamed himself for Masaki's death the same way Ichigo did for all those 6 years. Yuzu couldn't take it anymore. The sight of her father tearing up and the realization that he had done everything in his power to protect them all those years warmed and broke her heart at the same time. Thus, she immediately rushed towards him and embraced him. Likewise, Karen, almost brought to tears by her father's words and by the same realization that her father couldn't do anything to stop her mother's death, soon joined Yuzu in her embrace, burying her head on her father's abdomen just like her. Isin quivered as Karen, immediately after hugging him, spoke, Dad, I'm sorry I didn't know, and began to cry, the truth of what her father had been truth from start to finish now clear to her. Thank you, Dad, for everything, also spoke Yuzu, her voice filled with nothing but affection and gratitude for everything he did for her and her sister and Ichigo. And all at once, Isin's sadness disappeared, replaced by joy as he hugged his daughter's back, now shedding tears of happiness before declaring, I'm so proud of you, and I love you with all of my heart, Yuzu. Karen, his voice just as affectionate and loving as that of his daughters. Earwormed, Orihime looked at Isin embracing his daughters with a smile as Ichigo, with a look of pity and compassion, walked towards him, stopping just a few inches before him. Yuzu and Karen pulled themselves out of the embrace as Isin looked at his son and called out Ichigo, his voice still filled with dejection. Which then turned into great surprise as Hai-san immediately hugged him, while Yuzu and Karen watched with a warming smile. Ichigo then closed his eyes as he embraced his father and spoke, Dad, I'm sorry I didn't know that you had to go through so much, and please forgive me, if only I hadn't thrown myself in the middle of the street to save that kid. His voice beginning to crack down in grief as he had realized after recalling that Isin said that Masaki would have never forgiven him if he had died before his father. He couldn't even imagine the sorrow and grief that now haunted his dad's soul. For a moment, Isin remained still, his breath taken away as his son, instead of decking him in the face, embraced him tenderly and immediately forgave him for lying to him his entire life. Smiling joyously, he hugged his son back, despite now being nothing more than a soul, and replied without hesitation, no longer crying, no, Ichigo, forgive me for having lied to you all this time, only now have I realized that by doing so, I was only delaying the inevitable. You and your sisters were inevitably going to be thrown into the mix no matter what I did. Soundtrack ends. Yuzu and Karen looked at their father with a look of understanding and compassion, knowing full well that their father did the best he could have possibly done to keep them safe all these years, while Orihime was nearly moved to tears by the heartwarming embrace shared by Ichigo and his father. It was now clear to her just how much they loved each other, in spite of the tough guy exterior that Ichigo would often project most of the time. What you did today for that kid can't be expressed by words alone, declared Isin as he removed himself from the embrace, smiled at Ichigo and placed a hand on his son's left shoulder. I'm so proud of you, my son. And your mother would feel the same way. If only she could see what a kind and mature young man you've become, Ichigo. The orange-haired teenager returned the smile and declared, with the same love and affection, and I'm proud to have had you as my dad. His face then took on an irked expression as he stated, although you were kinda of a prick, always waking me up by jumping on me like that. Though I guess you did that in order to keep my skill on check, so thanks for that too. Earning an amused laugh from Yuzu and Karen, while Orihime giggled cutely. Yeah, I know. I just wanted to reply Issen. Only for his eyes to widen in shock upon sensing two spiritual presences nearby that were not those of any normal souls. A concerned look formed on all of the teenagers' faces, and Yuzu asked, Dad, what's going on? Before Orihime, Ichigo and Karen realized that two hollows were nearby. Ichigo. Take your sisters and get away. Cried out Orihime before she went towards the door of the Kurosaki house, swiftly opened it, and to her surprise the two hollows were standing right in front of her, a few meters away. One of them, which stood on all fours, resembled a wingless dragon, with a white skull-like mask equipped with a wide mouth full of sharp teeth, two horns that extended from the back of its skull and glowing yellow eyes. It had a pitch-black skinned, lean and muscular body with 5 sharp claws coming out of its 5-fingered hands and feet and a white skeletal lashing tail. The other one resembled a massive 4-meter-tall ape with green fur all over its body except its chest and abdomen, which was black, as well as its mask. As Orihime went outside under the rain and rounded her eyes on both hollows in defiance and resolution, the hollow that resembled a dragon spoke, well, what do we have here? Apparently this human girl can see us. His reverberating and snake-like voice sending chills on Orihime's spine. How interesting. That spiky-haired boy looks so delicious, but she will make for one equally interesting meal. Remarked the ape-like hollow, his voice even deeper than the draconic one, as he cracked the fingers of his massive hands in preparation of his next meal. Ast. Destiny awaits normal version. These hollows of course had no idea of who they were up against. Even if she was nowhere near as powerful as her friends, she had demonstrated to be perfectly capable of handling such basic hollows, as that female jellyfish one found out the hard way when she went for Totsuki and Chizuru's souls. And she'll die before she'll let one of this freaks eat Ichigo. Thus, with a look of pure determination and not a hint of fear, she declared, over my dead body. Before extending both of her arms towards them, joining her hands together and beginning to chant Koten Zansh. That won't be necessary, young lady. Interrupted Issen, while gently placing a hand on her left arm. Orihime looked at Ichigo's father, who gave her a kind look before ordering, get back to the others and look after them. I'll make this quick, while glancing at Ichigo and his sisters who were peeking through the door to see what was going on, instead of running away. As Orihime did as she was told, Issen's turned towards the two hollows and after narrowing his eyes towards them in contempt, remarked casually, you know, it's not nice to interrupt people who are in the middle of a conversation. Didn't your parents ever teach that to you? While folding his arms over his chest. Amused, the two hollows looked at Issen with their glowing yellow eyes, immediately recognizing him as a soul reaper. The draconic one then spoke up, Look, a lone soul reaper. This just keeps getting better and better. While unfurling its long black tongue and licking its teeth, overjoyed to have found an even more enticing meal, and eagerly looking forward to sink his teeth in Issen flesh. You can have him. I'll go for the girl and the boy. Commanded the green-furred ape one. But as soon as the hollow spoke those words, Issen grabbed the hilt of his Zanpakuto with his right hand, while gripping his sheath with his right one, startling both of them. You know, I've never really hated you hollows. After all, you do what you do because just as we eat food you eat souls. Problem is, he began, while drawing his Zanpakuto from his sheath and pointing it at both of them, that soul behind me just so happens to be the one of my son. So unless you two have a death wish, I would suggest you crawl back to whatever shithole you came from before I cut you in half. Orihime, Yuzu and Karen looked in awe as Ichigo's father faced the two hollows on his own, without a tiny shred of fear and doubt, acting the same way a man would act when faced with two ants. As Issen predicted, the two hollows roared monstrously with their signature before charging towards him, intending to consume him instead. What happened next left all four teenagers in awe and astonishment, as Issen simply grabbed the hilt of his Zanpakuto with his other hand, now dual-wielding it before raising it up before bringing it back down and declaring burn, in Jetsu. Ichigo, Orihime, Karen and Yuzu watched with their mouths agape as blazing flames covered Issen's Zanpakuto, which engulfed even its tassels, creating long trailing streams, and at the same time, a blazing orange aura of fire covered Issen and the ground beneath him. And as the hollows bared down on him, Ichigo's father simply brought his Zanpakuto back on his right side and, faster than Yuzu and Karen could see, slashed the two hollows in half with a quick diagonal slash, releasing the flames that had gathered around his sword at the same time. The two hollows were literally consumed by the flames, which completely erased them from existence. Amazing, he's got the same power as the head captain, remarked Ichigo, utterly blown away. While it wasn't quite as powerful as Yamamoto's Raijin Jaka, he didn't expect his father's Zanpakuto to also be capable of manipulating fire. Wow, he didn't even need to use it, but he did it nonetheless to show us how strong he really is, remarked an even more astounded Orihime, having figured out that if he wanted to, Isin could have easily taken out these two hollows with just a single swing of his released Zanpakuto. Dad, I have to take it back. You're possibly the coolest person I've ever known. That was so badass. Mused Karen to herself while Yuzu had been so blown away by what she had seen that she can't even speak. Both of them had to rethink their entire image of him. All this time he was this goofy and hopeless middle-aged man that always behaved like a child, much to her chagrin. She had no idea that he was actually this powerful. And now she had understood why he had acted like this for most of their life. It was actually his way of protecting them from these creatures. Ichigo suddenly called out Isin, pulling all three of his children, plus Orihime out of their trance of amazement as the flames faded away from his Zanpakuto. I've noticed how ever since you lost your Soul Reaper powers, you've been even more unhappy than you were before you became a Soul Reaper more than a year ago. Ichigo's eyes widened. He knew. His dad had in fact taken notice of his depression. Once again he was surprised by how deceivingly observant his father was, in spite of how childish he acted most of the time. Then again, he is a former captain, so naturally it would make sense that he would be this analytical. Well, now that you've died and are nothing more than a soul, you can get them back the same way you did before you and your friends went to the Soul Society. But not today. You must already be quite shocked by everything I've told you earlier. Declared Isin, confirming his theory and restoring his son's resolve while sheathing his sword back in its holster. Soundtrack ends. He then turned towards him and said, of course, the choice will ultimately remain yours and yours alone. But you should rest for now. It's been a long and tiring day already for all of us. While walking towards him and the girls. As he went back inside, an ecstatic Yuzu squealed, Dad, that was so cool. I didn't know you had a sword that you could light up on fire at will. While the others, including Isin, smiled. After all, in spite of having been forced to grow up at an earlier age than most other girls, due to her mother's death, she was still a girl, and thus she looked so adorable when she acted like that. Isin petted her daughter in the head before he went back into his living body that still lied on the floor, got up and declared, alright, now that all of that is out of the way, let's have some dinner. But before that he paused, looking at Orihime, whose clothes were all wet due to having gone out while it was still raining, and stating, I think we should get this girl some new clothes. Orihime gasped and then, after looking at herself, finally realized how wet all of her clothes were. She then squealed in embarrassment as her voluptuous figure could be clearly seen through her drenched clothes, which hung tightly on her body, especially on her big breasts, causing Yuzu and even Karen to blush upon seeing just how beautiful her body was. Both of them couldn't believe that it would only be a few years before their body would become like that. And so, after giving Orihime new clothes, she joined Ichigo and his family at dinner and was blown away by how good Yuzu's cooking was. She felt so happy being for once in the company of a caring and loving family, one she never had. She laughed, joked and talked about many of the fond memories and past experiences that Ichigo's family shared and the many experiences Orihime had at school and with her friends. Yuzu and Karen were equally happy to have the company of someone as joyful and radiant as Orihime. Truth be told, she reminded them of their mother due to not only how kind and cheerful she was, but also due to how similar the color of her hair was to that of Masaki. Ichigo did his best to smile and chuckle as he spent what he was sure to be his last dinner with his family. Fortunately, in spite of being no more than a soul, he could still eat and thus got the chance to enjoy Yuzu's wonderful food for what he was sure would be the last time. Later on, as dinner was over, he said goodnight to his father and sisters and went to his bedroom, followed by Orihime, who decided to keep him company on what would probably have been the last day of his life in the world of the living. As he lied on his bed with his back, he looked at Orihime, who sat on the edge of his bed close to him, and told her, I hope you enjoyed Yuzu's food. She really knows how to cook. The orange-haired teenage girl replied with a smile, yes, it was some of the best food I ever had, but her voice, filled with melancholy, made it clear that what happened had saddened her. She was fully aware that he would have never been with her and his family again. He then sat on his bed and looked at her with sadness before saying, Orihime, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Only for the girl to hug him tightly and reply, no, it's okay, you saved that kid's life. It was the right thing to do. And besides, she paused, while looking him in the eyes and giving him the sweetest smile one could think of, I know that you will be happy with your powers back. And that is enough for me. Earwormed, Ichigo smiled back at her and returned the hug, his heart now at peace that no matter what, Orihime will be happy that once he would get his powers back, he will finally become happy again. And with that, both of them went to bed, with Ichigo sharing his bed with the girl he had saved from the clutches of Aizen. And soon, sleep overtook them. It didn't take long for the news of Ichigo's death to reach all of the people who knew him. The next morning, the rain of last night had given way to another beautiful, sunny day, with few to no clouds in the sky, a far cry from the thundery weather of the day before. Thus, our focus now shifts from the house of the Kurosaki family to what appeared to be a simple two-store shop located in the Mitsumiya district of Karakura town. Two teenage boys were playing baseball right in front of it as it was Sunday, therefore they didn't have to go to school. One of them with black spiky hair, a red shirt and short black pants, holding a baseball bat in his left hand and a ball on his right one, held the ball up slightly and declared Jinta home run. With a smile before letting it go and hitting it with his bat, propelling it towards his friend with the glove, a slightly overweight teen that wore a black shirt with a green jacket above and brown short pants who replied got it. Only for another hand to stop the ball in its tracks mid-flight before said teen could catch it, surprising both of them. Then an annoyed voice, that of another teenage boy came quit hitting the baseball. The kid with the red shirt had only had time for his eyes to widen as the one who caught the ball yelled in front of someone's house. And threw the ball back at him in less than a second with shocking speed, hitting him square in the stomach with it, knocking the air out of him and causing the teen to fall on the ground with his arms clutching his stomach. Then a shadow loomed over the teen as he was still clutching his poor stomach, so he turned his head to the right and saw the one responsible for throwing the ball back into his stomach. "Oh, hey Jinta," he managed after gathering some air. Looming over him was Jinta Hanakari, one of the 3 employees of the Urahara shop, the shop that actually caters to all Soul Reaper needs, but that was also open to all clients who were spiritually aware. The Redeed had grown considerably in a year, now standing a good 15 meters tall with his hair slicked back, and he now wore a sleeveless blue shirt above his white t-shirt, edged with white and grey pants and no shoes, which left his feet bare. "And the only one allowed to hit a Jinta home run is me," he proclaimed, looking at the kid he had just struck in the stomach with disdain and annoyance, only to be struck in the head by a karate chop. The Redeed teenager immediately froze in place upon being struck, his eyes rolled into the back of his head, and he comically fell down on the ground, unconscious. The one responsible for this was an incredibly tall and muscular, lightly tan-skinned man that had cornrowed black hair and a large handlebar mustache connected to his sideburns. He wore a pair of rectangular-shaped glasses and a white muscle shirt with a blue apron above, olive green pants and brown shoes. He was in fact Tesai Tsukabishi, former captain of the Kido Corps, now living as a human in the world of the living in Ariatsu concealing Gigai, after being exiled from the Soul Society due to being framed by Aizen, along with Kisuke Urahara, for what happened to the Vizards more than a century ago. He hadn't changed at all ever since Ichigo and his friends met him along with Kisuke for the first time, more than a year ago. It is not right to throw a baseball that hard at someone who doesn't even have a mitt. He spoke, chastising the now unconscious Jinta as he picked him up by his armpits and easily put him up on his left shoulder. At the same time, out of the newly opened door of the shop came an utterly beautiful girl with long black hair with a purple tint divided into 2 long pigtails and short strands between her blue eyes. She wore a brown school uniform as well as white socks and brown school shoes. In spite of now looking like a young woman, she was in fact Yururu Tsumijiya, one of the other 2 owners of the shop, along with her superior Tesai. It was almost unbelievable how much she had grown in just a year, how her body had changed from that of a cute young girl to the voluptuous and attractive one of a young woman. Putting her soft hands on her thighs and kneeling slightly towards the 2 teens, Yururu, with her usual gloomy and sad expression on her face, apologized by saying "We're sorry. Is your stomach okay?" She then turned towards Jinta and remarked "I know that Jinta can act so juvenile" before turning towards the 2 teens again and giving them a soft radiant smile, "But would you still be willing to play with him sometime?" She asked them, her voice so beautiful, enchanting and soothing in spite of her somewhat gloomy expression that, coupled with the beauty of her body, it entranced the 2 teens, yes, even the one that was still lying on the ground clutching his stomach. "Yeah, why we'd love to," proclaimed the 2 teens with a blush on their cheeks, emaciated by Yururu's beauty. To them it was like seeing and hearing an angel. And with that they got up and left. And while Yururu and Tesai with the unconscious Jinta still on his shoulder, returned to the door of the shop, now opening it fully, thus opening the shop to its clientele like every day, a familiar voice interrupted them as Mr. Urahara home, causing them to turn towards where it came from. Before they could answer, the owner of the shop cheerfully replied, "Yes, here I am." And sure enough, out of the shop walked out the former captain of Squad 12, Kisuke Urahara, the tall, lean man with light skin, grey eyes, messy, light blonde hair with strands framing the sides of his face and hanging between his eyes and with chin stubble. Not having changed in the slightest in the course of the year, still wearing the same dark green samu with a black haori above, traditional Jetta sandals, and his trademark striped dark green and white bucket hat. With his fan in his hand and with his usual laid-back smile, he greeted, "Well, I didn't expect you to come here so soon, Mr. Ishida." Greeting none other than Ryu, flanked by Tatsuki, Kigo and Mizuro. We all came as soon as we heard the news of what happened. Stated the Quincy, wearing a white shirt and gray jeans. Yeah, we thought you and your employees would already know, and since we know Ichigo's not actually gone yet, we figured out he might have come to your place. Added Tatsuki, who wore a black shirt with a red jacket above, as well as black pants and shoes. Kisuke and Tessai were surprised of how relatively calm Ichigo's friends were and how well they had taken the news of his death. And again, they had already filled them out on what Ichigo and his spiritually aware friends had been doing all along, so they knew that he still existed, albeit as a soul. His smile leaving his lips, Kisuke looked at the teen seriously before stating dryly, "You're right about that, Miss Arasawa. Although he didn't come here yet." He then paused, his gaze wandering towards the ground. He probably had some talk he needed to have with his father. Earning a puzzled look from all four teenagers. "What do you mean, Mr. Urahara? You talk as if you're involved in all of this?" Asked Mizuro, who was wearing a red shirt with a white sweater on top, as well as light gray jeans and black shoes, not understanding why he sounded so worried. "That's because he actually is. There is still much we haven't told you." Came another voice from within the shop, a slightly deep masculine one. Everyone turned towards where it came and Tatsuki, Mizuro and Kigo were surprised to see a black cat with yellow eyes coming out of it. "Oh, hi there, Yuruchi. Seems you've decided to join us on this meeting too." Greeted casually Kisuke with a smile while putting his fan in front of his face. Uryu, already acquainted with the cat due to it having accompanied him and his friends to the Soul Society, simply bowed down and greeted, more politely, Mr. Yuruchi. Having never seen its true side. "Pan it, Kisuke. This whole thing is a lot more serious than what you think." "We have no time for jock," replied the cat, now known as Yuruchi, only to stop upon noticing Ichigo's high school friends, people that never had the chance to be introduced to. "Ah, you must be Ichigo's classmates. We never got the chance to introduce ourselves." "I'm Yuruchi," and I began the cat again, only for a puzzled look to make its way on his face as soon as he saw the dumbfounded looks on Tatsuki, Mizuro and especially Kigo. Yuruchi then asked him, "Why are you staring at me like that?" with an awkward tone. A few moments of silence that seemed like an eternity passed before. "Aya. No way. That cat can talk," comically shouted Kigo while putting his hands in front of him in a scared and defensive posture. Uryu, Tatsuki, Mizuro and even Yuruchi all sweat dropped at the sight of the 17-year-old, freaking out at a talking cat after all the supernatural stuff he had seen. "And I thought I overreacted when I first met him," mused an embarrassed Uryu in his mind, recalling how he had pretty much the exact same reaction when he met Yuruchi for the first time when the cat, Orihime and Chad went to visit him while he was training in a favorite secluded spot of his that was near a waterfall. "Really? That's how you react to a talking cat after all the crazy and scary stuff you and your friends have seen?" Sighed Yuruchi, not expecting the same reaction he got when he met Uryu for the first time. "Honestly, don't be such a wuss," he admonished, expecting a more mature reaction for once. "And they still haven't seen everything," mused Kisuke to himself in amusement. If this was that kid's reaction of seeing a talking cat, he wondered how he would have reacted if said black cat would have. He was pulled out of his lecherous thoughts by another familiar deep voice. "If it makes you feel any better, Kigo, I had a similar reaction when I first met him." Causing Uryu, Tatsuki, Kigo and Mizuro to all gasp in shock. As they turned around, they were greeted by the sight of a muscular, nearly 2-meter tall, dark-skinned young man with pronounced cheekbones and wavy brown hair that hung over his brown eyes. He wore a dark green long-sleeved shirt, blue jeans and white shoes, and in spite of his stoic and somewhat menacing appearance, he was someone they all knew very well. "Chad?" They all called out in surprise, not believing that their friend Yasutora Sato, more commonly known as Chad, due to being half Mexican and half Japanese, had also come. He hadn't changed much in the last year ever since the defeat of Aizen, except for a small goatee having grown on his chin. "Ah, Mr. Sato. So you've come too." Greeted Kisuke, fan still in front of his face, "Well, Mizuro asked you too, Chad. Have you heard about what happened?" in a worried tone. "Yeah. I was at work yesterday when I found out," he answered, surprising Uryu and Tatsuki slightly. Lately he had begun to skip school, thus they didn't see him as often as they usually did. Kigo and Mizuro were the only people he had talked with of his recent job. "So that's why you were skipping school lately? Was it because of a new job you found?" asked the purple-haired tomboy while folding her arms over her chest, looking at the massive young man with an inquisitive look. "Yeah. I needed some money, so I got employed as a bartender at a local bar in Naruki City," simply stated Chad, surprising Ayu and Tatsuki. "You, a bartender?" asked Tatsuki in disbelief, pointing at him with a finger. "Seriously, how do you even fit in a suit?" she asked, not believing what she was hearing. Adjusting his glasses, Uryu remarked, "I see. As surprising as it is to hear that, it's a job I can see you doing very well." He then paused, looking at his friend in seriousness before asking, "But how do you plan to combine it with your studies? You're at your last year of high school and you've already skipped several days. You're not actually planning to leave school now that you only have a year left before you graduate, right?" Dad sighed and replied, "Look, it's complicated. A lot has happened in the last few weeks, but it's best if we talk about it another time. Right now we have to." Only to be interrupted by a familiar voice, "Hi there guys. And good morning to you too, Chad. Been a while since the last time I saw you." All 5 teenagers turned towards where the voice came from and promptly spotted Ichigo, Orihime, his dad and his sisters, walking towards them. Normally, nothing would have been out of the ordinary except for the fact that the orange-haired strawberry was now a ghost. Ichigo called out Tatsuki, Uryu and Chad at the same time, while Mizuru and Kigo could only look in shock and bewilderment. Kisuke, on the other hand, smiled upon seeing the soul of the young man whom he had taught how to fight in 10 days, before he and his friend set off to the Soul Society in their quest to save Rukia, and with the fan still in front of his face, he jovially greeted Ichigo. "My boy, it's been a while. You really should have come here more often and see all the cool new gadgets we've gotten this year just like your sisters did." Slightly annoyed at his cheerful behavior in spite of what had happened, Ichigo's sweat dropped and with an awkward look and voice, he snorted, "Really, Kisuke? That's how you greet a guy that only died yesterday?" It was only because he had grown more mature that he didn't immediately punch the buffoon in the face or call him hat and clogs, as that attitude of his often got him on his nerves, especially with all the ridiculous item gimmicks and training techniques. He may owe him everything for teaching him how to fight and allowing him to go to the Soul Society and Hueco Mundo, but that childish side of his still annoyed the crap out of him to no end. At the same time, the 5 teens, Uryu and Tatsuki in particular, were surprised to see Orihime besides Ichigo and his family. The long purple-haired tomboy went to her best friend and greeted Orihime, "You're here too?" with a worried look and tone. With a saddened look, the orange-haired teenage girl replied, "Yes. Ichigo was walking me home when we saw this little kid playing football on the sidewalk when he mistakenly threw his ball in the middle of the road. He saw that a car was coming straight towards the poor kid and without a second of hesitation, he jumped in and pushed him away." Her voice beaming up slightly, her admiration towards Ichigo, made perfectly clear from her tone, but unfortunately he can't save himself. Uryu, Chad, Tatsuki, Mizuru and Kigo all looked at Ichigo in awe and admiration. The former 2 knew him very well, having fought at his side when they went to the Soul Society and to Hueco Mundo, but even they had no idea that he actually was this selfless. And of course the 3 other teens were so blown away by what they had heard that they even had to rethink their entire image of him, yes, even Tatsuki. Ichigo called out a saddened Mizuru, heartbroken that his life had been cut short so soon. Ast. BL 995, funny soundtrack. But it doesn't matter, for Ichigo is now a soul and thus isn't completely gone, declared Orihime, her voice now cheerful, causing the 5 teens to do a double take. "Afterwards we went to his family's house, we had dinner with his dad and sisters, and Ichigo even allowed me to sleep with him in his bed." Karen and Yuzu sweat dropped. How could she be so cheerful after all that's happened and all the shocking revelations she had heard last night? Uryu, Chad and Mizuru looked at Orihime awkwardly, a little unnerved by how happy she sounded in spite of what happened the day before. However, that paled in comparison to Kigo and Tatsuki's reactions. "He did what?" They both yelled at the same time, Kigo in comical shock and Tatsuki in outrage and disbelief. Raising his hands in defense, Ichigo tried to tell them how things really went. "Look, I can explain," while Uryu and Chad's sweat dropped. Only for Yuruchi to interject, "Ichigo, you never cease to amaze me." His voice filled with glee and delight at what he heard, causing the spirit of the teen's eyes to widen comically and to turn towards the black cat whom he had not seen for a whole year, who was walking towards him while Yuruchi. He called out, caught completely off guard. "Literally the first thing you do after dying and becoming a ghost is sleeping with a girl. I didn't know what a skirt chaser you were beneath all that shy tough guy exterior of yours." He teased in delight, causing Ichigo's cheeks to turn even redder than a tomato. He had forgotten how much that blasted cat liked to tease him. After all, Ichigo was still a teenager, and so Yuruchi loved to play with his more shy and sensitive side. He quickly lost it and yelled in embarrassment, his arms comically facing the ground parallel to his body and his fists clenched. "That's not how things went. I merely let her sleep in my bed. Besides, how the fuck am I supposed to make love with a living person if I'm dead?" Causing Yuruchi and Kisuke to laugh in amusement, and even Issen had to visibly strain himself in order to not bust out laughing at his son's outburst, while Yuzu gasped in disbelief at the sight of the talking black cat. An ecstatic smile made its way on her lips before she grabbed her cheeks with her hands and exclaimed cutely, "Always talking cat. So adorable." Noticing the joyful look on Ichigo's younger sister, Yuruchi decided to play along, and so, he went to Yuzu and rubbed his head on her legs while purring. Yuzu wasted no time and began to pet the black cat, overcome by such cuteness, while Karen could only look in awkward confusion and muse to herself in her mind, this just keeps getting better and better. Orihime, with an awkward smile and a blush on her cheeks, then chimed in, really guys, we didn't do anything. We merely shared his bed together. That's not the same as making love while putting her hands in front of her and waving them left and right in an attempt to deny what happened, earning an embarrassed look on both Tatsuki and Uryu. Actually, that's exactly what sharing a bed means. Bluntly and awkwardly pointed out the Quincy while Tatsuki sighed at the orange-haired girl's naivety. Even at this age, she was still as naive and innocent about many things as ever. Ashamed and with her blush growing even more, Orihime covered her face with her hands in guilt and spoke, her voice abashed, I knew it, I should have slept on the floor. But he was so sweet. I couldn't just say no to him. And turned away, too embarrassed to look at her friends. With a sigh, Tatsuki walked to her and gently patted her on the head, while reassuring, don't worry, Orihime. As long as he was nice to you, that's all that matters. While smiling at her. Inside though, a part of her was seething in annoyance. Ichigo, you really are an idiot sometimes. Why didn't you share her bed with her earlier this year? While looking at the teen, who was still blushing heavily from Yuichi's teasing, with exasperation. Soundtrack ends. Turning towards Issen, Kisuke greeted, good to see you too, Issen. I take it from the way things are that you've told your family everything, right? His voice still carefree but with a hint of seriousness, gathering the attention of everyone. Ichigo's father, returning the smile, replied yeah. And actually, they took it quite well, way better than what I was expecting. While folding his arms over his chest. A look of confusion made its way on the faces of Ryuchad, Tatsuki, Mizuru and Kigo all at once. Noticing said confusion on all teens' faces, Issen sighed and remarked, not sure how these guys will handle the whole story though. Feeling a little uncomfortable due to the looks they were giving him. At the same time, Yuichi walked back towards Kisuke and jumped on his left shoulder. As the cat climbed onto the top of his bucket hat, the merchant declared stoically, perhaps it's better if we talk about it over some tea. It's gonna take a while. And motioned everyone to follow him inside his shop. Thus one by one, Ichigo, Issen, Karen, Yuzu, Orihime, Ryuchad, Tatsuki, Mizuru and Kigo followed Kisuke, Yuichi, Tessai, with a still unconscious Jinta on his shoulder, into the shop, while Yururu closed the door. Thus, all 14 people gathered in the hall of the shop, where Kisuke would usually have lunch or dinner, removed their shoes out of respect, with the exception of Ichigo since he was a soul, and they all took a place in the room. And after some tea, the merchant as well as Ichigo's father, began to retell the events that happened more than 17 years ago. And needless to say, Ichigo's friends were in for one shocking revelation after another. From learning that Issen was a Soul Reaper all along, which in particular shocked Ryu, to learning how he met Masaki for the first time, to how Ichigo actually had his hollow powers from birth, his Shiba lineage and so on and so forth. Ast. Will of the heart. Ryu can't believe all of this. Not only was Ichigo's father a Soul Reaper all along, but he was actually related to Kukaku and Ganju all this time. Most shockingly of all, was the reveal that his friend had inherited his hollow powers from birth and that the moment he fully lost control of himself, when Orihime tried to heal him from the mortal injury Ulquiorra had inflicted on his body, he took on the Hollow White's appearance. And given that he was right there when it happened and that when he lost control, Ichigo threw his sword straight into the Quincy's abdomen when Uryu tried to bring him back to reason and was even about to obliterate him with a Zero, were it not for the fourth Espada managing to cut one of the horns of his mask, thus returning him back to normal. He was by far the most shocked of all those who heard that revelation. Tad, Tatsuki, Mizuru and Kigo on the other hand, were left speechless by what they heard. All 4 teenagers, with Chad's exception, found it hard to believe that Ichigo had powers similar to that of a Hollow. Not only that, but they laid dormant within him ever since he was born, locked away by a seal placed on his mother years before he was even conceived. Ichigo called out the purple-haired tomboy seated near to him, now understanding why he tried to keep her and his friends out of all the mess he had gotten himself into. How even after witnessing him as a Soul Reaper, he still tried to keep her out of harm's way. She can't really blame him for that though, after hearing the horrors of what he, Ryu, Orihime and Chad went through, and of all the extremely powerful people and monsters they had gone up against. There simply wasn't anything she could have done if all of them were even a fraction as powerful as the then godly Aizen who hunted her down, along with Kigo, Mizuru, Chizuru and even Don Kananji, just to test his newfound powers. And she shuddered to think that he had almost turned into a monster, one similar to the jellyfish-looking one that almost took control of her and Chizuru and claimed their soul. Ichigo then turned towards Tatsuki as the long-haired girl began to apologize, I'm sorry for how I treated you. Had I known the entire story from the beginning she can't finish as the orange-haired soul, with a smile, replied no, it's okay. Even if you came to hate me but were safe and happy, I wouldn't have cared. I would have done everything to ensure others were kept safe. Causing her to look in his eyes with happiness as he then declared, in fact, if it was up to me, I would have kept even Orihime, Uryu and Chad out of this. But then I realized that it was never my choice to make, just as it was never my choice to keep you, Mizuru and Kigo out of all this, since sooner or later, you would have all been thrown in the mix no matter what I did, and for that I apologize, Totsuki. His voice earnest and apologetic as well. No, Ichigo. You have nothing to apologize for. Suddenly proclaimed Kigo, who sat on his left, causing everyone to look at him in bewilderment and surprise upon seeing him acting mature instead of freaking out. With a solemn look on his face he added, there was nothing Mizuru, Totsuki and I could have done. And considering how both Uryu and Chad even lost an arm at one point, it's only a miracle that we came out of it in one piece after that lunatic Aizen chased us down. Earning a nod from the two aforementioned teenagers while Yuzu and Karen, who sat on Ichigo's left and right respectively, shuddered, not even imagining how horrifying it must have been to have experienced such pain, well you weren't even a fully grown adult. Uryu and Chad, who were seated besides Kisuke, simply took a deep breath, remembering all too well the pain they felt on both occasions. It's just like what I said yesterday to my family. Children should not be risking their lives on a daily basis, they should enjoy life, make friends and explore the world. Putting their lives on the line is a choice they should never be, began Isin, who sat on Ichigo's right, besides Karen dressed in his shihakusho, trying to reinforce Kigo's point and reassure Ichigo's friends that what he did was for the better. Only for Uryu to abruptly get up and interject, you can stop right there, Mr. Kurosaki, if your aim is to lecture us for making our own choices without anyone having to decide for us. Visibly ticked off slightly by those words. With everyone greatly surprised by his reaction, Ichigo and Orihime called out Uryu. I am a Quincy. I have been taught how to fight more than 9 years ago by my grandfather Soken Ishida, but he never forced me to make that choice. I made the choice to honor the ways of the Quincy and to fight for no other reason than to protect the weak all by myself. He spoke sternly, rounding his blue eyes towards those of Ichigo's father. We all put our lives on the line to save Rukia and Orihime because they were our friends. That's all there was to it. That was enough reason for us to fight. Deep inside, Isin couldn't help but smile as Uryu's voice softened the more he spoke as he recalled all the memories of his friendships. He really is the carbon copy of his father still. I'm glad he was able to put aside his hatred of the Soul Reapers and become friends with my son. He mused to himself, making a mental note to himself to be a lot more nicer to him in the future. Ichigo and Orihime were also heartwarmed that Uryu had even come to view Rukia, a Soul Reaper, one of his supposed sworn enemies, a friend. That's right. Chimed in Chad, his voice ever compassed and calm. I put my faith in Ichigo, because just as he risked his life to protect me time and time again from various thugs, he was going to do the same for Rukia and Orihime. Earning a smile from Kigo and Mizuru, knowing far too well how deep their friendship was and how far back it went. Chad really was the definition of a gentle giant. He only ever fought back to protect his friends, even going as far as to never retaliate when the various thugs he confronted over the years beat him up. Chad called out Ichigo, suddenly remembering how he tried to keep even him and Uryu out from his quest to save Orihime, believing that by being with him at a time in which he still couldn't fully control his hollow side, they would have been hurt. I'm sorry for not believing in you and Uryu back then. I was afraid that by being around me, you would have, he began, apologizing for trying to shun them away at the time, something he had no right to do. Kisuke, seated right in front of him with Tessai behind him, was the one who interrupted him before he could continue. What did I always tell you, Ichigo? He asked him seriously, earning the strawberry's attention. Nothing can be born out of fear. Chad and Mr. Ishida followed you through hell and back because they believed in you. Did you really think that them knowing how your hollow powers worked would have shaken their resolve? He asked him, causing Ichigo to look in the merchant's eyes in realization upon recalling everything he taught him. And why do you think Orihime, a girl so gentle and sweet she would never hurt even a fly, followed you and your friends without a single moment of hesitation into the Soul Society, knowing full well that she would have faced people who wouldn't have thought twice about cutting her down if she was their enemy? For that matter, why is it that she endured all the psychological and physical torture she had to put up with while she was imprisoned inside Las Notches? Asked Yurichi as well, seated on Kisuke's right shoulder, causing Orihime's lips to part away slightly and her eyes to widen. Totsuki looked at her friend with commiseration, placing a hand on Orihime's. The first time the orange-haired girl told her what she had been through, the tomboy was a few inches away from crying. Totsuki couldn't even imagine how utterly terrible it must have been for her friend to be tortured psychologically, forced to eat, and having her belief that her friends would eventually come to rescue her being berated every single time she expressed it. But in spite of how horrible it was, Orihime surprisingly moved on from the ordeal with a smile on her lips, thanks to her friends and many months of comfort from them. Let me tell you why. For the same exact reason Uryu and Chad followed you. She fully believed that you and your friends would have saved her, and that's exactly what happened. Declared the cat, while Orihime looked away, still a bit ashamed that she couldn't have done more to prevent her from being captured. Ichigo's eyes shaked in realization while Uryu and Chad looked downwards. Ichigo, you should know by now that no man or woman, no matter how powerful they think they are, is an island. Trying to push everyone you care about away will only leave you alone. You would have never managed to save Orihime if you charged into Hueco Mundo all alone. Think of it like this. Sometimes we need a bridge and other times we are that bridge. No one can truly escape from troubled waters, rough seas and challenging days. There will always be times in our lives when we are given the chance to be the help others need, and times when we could use a little help from others. Taking a hand is just as important as offering one. Never forget that. Finally proclaimed Isin as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder, while everyone watched in awe and contemplation. Looking at his father in the eyes, Ichigo soon felt his own eyes blurry with tears of both happiness and sadness, as those words hit him deeply. Happiness for hearing just how much gratitude all his friends had for everything he had done for them. And sadness for having died, possibly not ever getting the chance to see some of them again. "Bad guys," he managed as he got up, his voice filled with both joy and sorrow. "Thank you for everything. I'm sorry. If only I hadn't thrown myself in the middle of the road to push that kid away." I looking downwards in shame and regret. He couldn't finish. One by one, Uryu, Chad, Tatsuki, Mizuru and Kigo all hugged him deeply in a circle. Isin, his daughters, Kisuke, Yuruchi and Tessai, all watched with a heartwarm smile as one by one Ichigo's friends voiced their affection towards him, all in the same order in which they hugged him. "Ichigo, you made me realize that I was wrong to assume that all Soul Reapers were selfish bastards. You and I may have gotten off with a rocky start, but you're probably the greatest friend I have ever made in my entire life, and for that I thank you. Without even knowing me, you faced an entire gang of thugs just to protect me. I will never forget what you did for me that day, for you only affirmed the most important thing my abuelo taught me. You should always fight only to protect those you care about. Ichigo, I have known you ever since you were 4. Ever since your mother died you were never truly happy. Then Rukia came and by making you a Soul Reaper, little by little, I saw that happiness return to you. Now that you are just a soul, you can finally return to being one again. You taught me that you should never judge someone by their looks alone. You and Chad were not the hoodlum bullies from hell others made you out. You were a kind and altruistic young man who never tolerated those who picked on those weaker than themselves and who never betrayed the principles you set to yourself. By saving that kid from being run over by a car, you upheld them. And I think that means a lot. You know why I tried to cheer you up all these years? I may be a goofy ass idiot, but even I recognize when someone is suffering. When you lost your powers and could never see Rukia again, you were even more depressed than before she entered our lives. You didn't just miss her. You missed being a Soul Reaper in general, having the strength to protect everyone. Well, now you have the chance to get your powers back. And I want you to know that even if we won't see each other again, I'll be happy to know that being a Soul Reaper again will finally bring your happiness back." Ichigo could only stand still as all of his friends, minus Orihime, professed their affection and bond for him, from Uryu declaring that he was his best friend, Chad declaring his admiration for him and his courage, Tatsuki expressing her happiness that he will finally become a Soul Reaper again, Mizuru being proud of him for saving that kid, and finally Kigo declaring that all this time he acted like an idiot to try and cheer him up because he wanted to see him happy. Thus, with a joyful smile, he hugged all of his friends back, tears of joy still falling out of his closed eyes, overjoyed to have heard just how much they cared about him once more. Deep down, he was heartbroken that he would have probably never be with them again, but he didn't care. They loved him the same. "Guys, thank you for everything," he proclaimed tenderly before as they all broke out of the embrace. He looked at Kigo and remarked, "And I was wrong about you too, Kigo. I had no idea you could be this mature." While putting a hand on the brown-haired teenager's shoulder, earning a soothing smile from him. Kisuke, Yuruchi, Orihime, Isin and his daughters all watched happily as the display of friendship with a heartwarm smile. They were all happy that even after what happened the day before, his friends still supported him, even after he had died. Soundtrack ends. Then Ichigo's face filled itself with resolve as he looked at the owner of the shop and spoke. "Kisuke, I've made up my mind. I want to get my powers back. Let's do that thing with that pit again." Earning a serious look from everyone, including his father. "Are you sure, my son? I could just use Konso and send you directly to the Soul Society." That way, asked a worried Isin, seeing his proposal as the safest one. Well, it would take him at least 6 years to become a Soul Reaper again, at least this way he wouldn't risk turning into a hollow while becoming one. "No, Dad, this time it will be different. This time I know what I have to do. And this time I don't have to get back my spirit energy. I feel it flowing through every inch of my body." Isin could only watch in awe at the look of pure resolution on his son's face. He really was willing to go through the same process through which he almost became a hollow again. Once again he had seen just how powerful Ichigo's resolve was. "I see. You're really willing to go through the shattered shaft again, aren't you, Ichigo?" asked Kisuke, wanting to hear the answer from him as he knew far too well how painful it was to him the first time. But after Ichigo, without a second of hesitation, nodded, the merchant finally got up and with a smile, he casually spoke, "Alright then. If there are no more objections, you may all follow me." While adjusting his hat. Thus, Kisuke led everyone back towards the main hall of the shop before he removed part of the floor at the center, revealing an astonishingly deep hole in a yellow ladder. One by one they all went down the hole through the ladder, which led them to an absolutely massive chamber that was almost as big as an entire city block. It housed what appeared to be a desert-like landscape with many small rocky formations that were at least 50 meters tall, and with the ceiling and walls painted to resemble a blue cloudy sky. It was in fact Kisuke's underground training room that he had built in just a single day by using technology from the Soul Society. Yuzu and Karen were in awe at what they were seeing. So much space in one enormous room underground, so large, it was even bigger than a city block. "Wow, this place is huge," exclaimed the light brown-haired sister of Ichigo while looking around in amazement, while her raven-haired sister remarked, "Just when I thought I had seen everything, how the hell did that guy build all of that? It wasn't all that difficult. Mr. Urahara simply used his knowledge of the technology of the Soul Society to construct this training ground," pointed out Tessai as he walked beside the two girls, with Yururu on his left surprising them even more, with Jinta still on his shoulder, who was regaining consciousness. As soon as he did and realized that he was being carried by the same guy who hit him squarely in the head with a karate chop, he immediately clenched his teeth in anger and yelled, "What the hell, Tessai? You almost split my head in half. What if I get brain damage, damn it?" While pounding the tall and muscular man's back with his hands, which had absolutely no effect on the former captain of the Kido Corps. Without uttering a word, Tessai proceeded to throw Jinta to the ground before he sat on him, while folding his arms over his chest. He then asked admonishingly, "And what if you broke that kid's ribsage with that bowl you threw at him? You need to be taught some respect, Jinta." As Yururu, with her face emotionless, proceeded to grab her left pigtail and use it to tickle Jinta's right foot. Which rather predictably caused Ariti to laugh and cry out, "Jaya ha ha ha. Yururu, stop that." And in response Yuzu laughed cutely at how Jinta was being disciplined, and even Karen couldn't help but chuckle, agreeing with Tessai that the Retid was way too much of a smug ass and a slacker at the same time. Taking a look around, Chad fondly recalled the time in which he trained with Renji in preparation for the war with Aizen and his Arankar army, and became friends with the lieutenant of Squad 6. "I wonder how he's doing nowadays," he mused to himself, recalling how he pitted his Brazo Derecho del Diablo against his Zanpakuto Zabumaru, who, in both its Shikai and Bankai, could extend itself almost without limit, essentially becoming a bladed whip, perfect from both striking enemies from afar and keeping them away from its user. Everyone then looked in silence as Kisuke stopped walking right in front of Ichigo, with his father besides him. Asked. "Nothing can be explained. Know this, Ichigo. Once you become a Soul Reaper again, there will be no turning back. You will never be human again. And as you may already know, Soul Reapers can live for much, much longer than humans can. For example, Head Captain Yamamoto, one of the oldest Soul Reapers in existence, is over 1,000 years old. I'm sorry for telling it to you like this, but began Kisuke, his voice completely devoid of his carefree spirit, sorrowful to tell this to the teen who he was indebted with. I'll outlast every single one of my friends. I'll still be a man in my late 20s to early 30s, when they will either be dead or in their old age, finished Ichigo, having already realized what the merchant meant while looking towards the ground in dejection. He knew very well that 10 years of human life are equivalent to 100 to that of a Soul Reaper, as Rukia revealed to him when he met her for the first time. Having overheard his and Kisuke's words, his friends and his sisters all looked at him in sadness while all at once, Ichigo's mind was clouded by uncertainty and fear. He didn't know if he could live with such pain and regrets. The pain of living to see his friends grow old, while he would remain a youthful man in his late 20s or early 30s by the time they would pass away. But then, Isin gently placed a hand on his son's left shoulder, snapping him out of his thoughts. As Ichigo looked at his father, dressed in his shahakusho, he saw that there was nothing but an encouraging smile on his lips. Whatever decision you may make, my son, know that all of us will always be there for you. All we wish for is for you to be happy. He spoke, looking at his son happily. Ichigo then turned backwards and saw that in spite of their sadness, all of the people he cared about were smiling encouragingly at him, as well as nodding towards him. Having made up his mind, Ichigo smiled and nodded back at his friends before turning back towards Kisuke and declaring without hesitation, "Let's do it." Kisuke simply nodded and turned towards Tessai and Yururu, who were still disciplining Jinta, and called out, "Yururu, would you be so kind to dig a deep hole? And Tessai, the axe." The mountain of muscles and mustache with the glasses and the young girl immediately procured themselves the axe and the shovel respectively. And as Yoru proceeded to dig the hole close by at astonishing speeds, surprising everyone in the room, Tessai walked towards Ichigo, Isin and Kisuke, with the axe rested on his left shoulder. He then stopped in front of all three, looked at Ichigo and asked, "Are you sure you want to go through this process again, young man? Not to be disrespectful, but the last time you came dangerously close to becoming a hollow, and it seemed to be quite painful." With a concerned tone, wanting to see if the strawberry was truly willing to go through it again. "Believe me, compared to all the fierce and gruesome battles I went through afterwards, it was nothing. I'm ready," resolutely replied Ichigo, not even bothering to get in detail of all the violent and gruesome ways he nearly lost his life on multiple occasions, chief of which, Kenpachi nearly tearing his guts out with his Zanpakuto. Ulquiorra blasting a Zero right in the middle of his chest not once but twice, Byakuya slashing him across the chest faster than his eyes could track in their first encounter, and so on and so forth. As he then extended his chain by throwing most of it on the ground, Tessai simply nodded after seeing the unwavering resolve on Ichigo's face and replied, "Very well then. Let us proceed." And with that, as soon as Isin and Kisuke took a step backwards, the former captain of the Kido Corps swiftly brought down the axe on Ichigo's chain of fate, immediately severing it in half. An impressed Kisuke looked at how Ichigo simply stood there motionlessly, his face not twisting in surprise at all as Tessai cut his chain. He had really come a long way. Just like it happened the first time, Ichigo felt his body growing weak due to the encroachment progress beginning to take effect, but he did his best to ignore the slight pain he felt. At the same time, Yoru had finished digging the 60-meter deep hole and declared, with the shovel still in her soft petite hands, "There, it's all finished. You're good to go." Her face still gloomy, but in spite of that she managed a faint encouraging smile towards Ichigo. After exchanging one last look with his father and his first teacher, Ichigo went to the rim of the hole before, without hesitation, he jumped onto it, followed by Tessai, while Totsuki, Kigo, Mizuro, Yuzu, Karen and Orihime all looked in concern as he jumped into the hole, his face devoid of any doubt or hesitation. "Ichigo, please, be okay," mused Orihime to herself, hoping that he would be alright. As they both landed on the ground harmlessly, 60 meters below, Tessai wasted no time and promptly held his palms away from each other, with his arms extended to the sides. He then clasped his hands together, intertwined his fingers intricately and chanted Bakudo number 99 part 1, Kin. And all at once Ichigo's arms were bound to his back by spiritual fabric and iron shafts. This time Ichigo knew what the muscular man did and thus remained calm as his hands were forcefully bound to his back. Nonetheless, he asked, "Is this really necessary? I know how to do it this time." "Sorry Ichigo, but considering how you almost turned into a hollow the last time, we can't afford to take any chances. Your arms will remain bound until you have reacquired your powers. And should the worst case scenario happen, I'll use the stronger version of Kin to restrain you before you fully turn into a hollow. It might kill you in the process, but it would be a far more merciful fate than turning into a creature that lives only to feed on others' souls. Nonetheless, it shouldn't take you as much time as it did last time, given how much your knowledge has expanded," replied truthfully Tessai, pulling no punches in explaining the young man what will happen to him should he fail to get his Soul Reaper powers back. Understanding everything, Ichigo nodded and replied, "I see. Well, let's get down to it then." And Tessai, he paused, while the former captain of the Kido Corps raised a brow, "Should you kill me if I'll become a hollow, I just want to say thanks to both you, Kisuke and Yoruichi. If it weren't for the three of you, I would have never managed to become strong enough to save Rukia. So whatever happens, I just want to say thank you. For everything." His voice sincere and full of gratitude. A smile crossed Tessai's lips, obscured slightly by his thick mustache, and he hummed approvingly, heartwarmed to see how far the young man had matured. Just a year ago, he would be quick to snort at others and be irritated for the slightest of provocations or for Kisuke's more childish antics. And with that, he sat down and retreated to his silence, while Ichigo got on his knees and closed his eyes, trying to awaken in his inner world. Having already practiced how to do so by using Jinzen, the technique Soul Reapers use to communicate with the spirits of their Zanpakuto, Ichigo cleared his mind and began to reach out for his inner world. It took him quite some time, perhaps even some hours, but eventually. After he opened them, he saw a clouded sky and many skyscrapers. As he got up, he noticed that he was standing on the side of one. With a dry voice, he spoke, "It's almost the same as it was the last time I've been to it. It's cloudy. It's almost like it's about," noting how, in spite of not being submerged in water, the sky of his inner world was still clouded. That meant. Ichigo called out a familiar deep masculine voice, and the strawberry soon turned towards where it came from. And just like the first time, more than a year ago, a lean-built middle-aged man with pale skin, high cheekbones, stubble and long ragged black hair with brown highlights, stood on a flagpole. The man wore a tattered white dress shirt with an upturned collar and cuffs, black pants, low-heeled boots and a long amorphous black overcoat with a burgundy highlight that flared out into ragged ends. The man's hair and coat seemed to be moving as if wind was blowing towards him. The orange-haired teen with a slight smile greeted Zangetsu. It's been a while upon recognizing the spirit of his Zanpakuto, standing on a flagpole just like the first time he met him. Looking at him without any emotion, the spirit replied, "You haven't changed in the slightest. Your heart is just as full of sadness and despair as it was on that day, a year ago before I taught you the final Jutsuga Tensho." Admonishing Ichigo for still harboring such feelings in his heart after saving all of his friends at the cost of his powers. Those words wiped the smile off Ichigo's face. With a dumbfounded expression, he asked, "You were here all this time, even after I had lost my powers?" "Of course I was. You simply can't access your inner world because the moment you lost your powers, you could never access your soul form, until now," replied Zangetsu, narrowing his blue eyes towards his master in disdain, "but it didn't take long for the rain to fall in this world again. And as I told you, when you are sad, it rains in this world. So tell me, Ichigo, why did sadness still linger in your heart even after you managed to save everyone you cared about? Was it because you missed having your powers?" Ichigo for a moment stopped breathing as soon as Zangetsu asked him those questions. He knew. He knew from the start. It was unsurprising given that as the manifestation of his Zanpakuto, he was a part of his soul. Looking downwards he declared, "Yes. As much as it pains me to admit it, I did want to have my powers back. Time and time again I told myself that the life of a normal human was the one I always wanted. Making a living out of helping the souls of the dead was never something I had planned." Zangetsu simply listened, his expression not changing in the slightest, but he was surprised to hear just how much self-loathing could be heard from Ichigo's voice. "But the truth is, once I became a soul reaper, I never felt happier in my whole life. I obtained the power to protect everyone. I made so many friends in the Soul Society, and I missed all of them. Now I can finally become one again," but he stopped for a brief moment, not managing to find the strength to speak. "You are not sure if you can live with the pain of leaving all the people of the world of the living you cared about. The thought of you outlasting almost every one of them brings you nothing but sorrow," finished Zangetsu, his face softening, having already figured out the conflict Ichigo had found himself in. That was why it wasn't raining in spite of the sky being cloudy. On one hand, Ichigo was overjoyed to become a soul reaper again. On the other hand, the thought of leaving all the living people he cared about saddened him greatly. Ichigo could only nod, his face filling itself with even more sadness. He couldn't even look Zangetsu in his eyes because he had him figured out already. He couldn't imagine how the old man must have felt enduring so much rain for so much time, so much sadness. "Then let me ask you this, Ichigo. Why did you choose to become a soul reaper in the first place?" asked Zangetsu, snapping Ichigo out of his inner conflict and causing him to look at the spirit of his Zanpakuto with wide eyes. "Was it not for your desire to protect everyone? It was through that desire that you overcame your fear. It was because of that oath you made to yourself that you looked forward, moved forward and never stopped. Was that not your greatest desire ever since your mother died on that fateful night?" And all at once Ichigo understood everything. He had come this far because of the oath he made to himself to never let anyone die and the faith he had placed in both himself and his friends. If he were to go back on that oath now, to let go of it, it would all have been for nothing. But sadness leaving his face completely, he looked at Zangetsu with determination and declared, "Yes. I swore to myself that I would never let anyone die after that night. And through that desire, I came this far. To go back on it right now would betray everything I've always stood for." His voice now filled with the same unshakable resolve, the same resolve that ultimately led to his victories over Kenpachi, Byakuya, Ulquiorra and finally, Aizen himself. Having finally made his decision and remembering everything Zangetsu taught him, Ichigo declared, "I'm ready, Zangetsu. Whatever may happen I will not look back, I will not hesitate and I will not run." His voice completely devoid of fear and hesitation. And as he let himself fall down the height of the skyscraper, a slight smile formed on Zangetsu's lips and he declared, "Then I will lend you my strength to you once more, Ichigo. Believe in yourself and your resolve will never betray you. Remember, you are not fighting alone. You never were." Heartwarmed to see the same young man he had watched grow again. The same young man he wanted to protect. As he fell down for what seemed like forever, the skyscrapers began to dissolve into countless boxes, just like on that day a year ago. Knowing full well that if he would find the one that contained his Zanpakuto, he would have become a hollow, Ichigo simply closed his eyes as he fell into a fissure in the ground which led him into water. He reopened them and saw himself surrounded by hundreds of those white boxes. As soon as he remembered that the soul ribbon of a soul reaper was red, a white ribbon of energy sprouted from every single one of those boxes. And sure enough, Ichigo immediately saw that one of them was red. He grabbed it, pulled it, and just like a year ago, in front of him, the box opened and the red hilt of his Zanpakuto with the golden tip and the blue sash around, said tip was there. Behind him, Zangetsu spoke. Remember what I told you, Ichigo. Cast off your fear. Look forward and go forward. Never stand still. Retreat and you will age. Hesitate and you will die. Shout my name, saying the same words he said to Ichigo when he trained with Kisuke. Without hesitation, the orange-haired teen shouted Zangetsu. And drew the Zanpakuto from the box. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the NANTO99 for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.